What do dead kings dream of? Maybe it's not legacy they seem to lose that faster than they lose their crowns. Maybe it's silence, the kind you bury under palaces, oceans, and lies. From golden thrones that vanished overnight to emperors whose hearts are still missing, these aren't just stories, they're warnings carved in royal blood. This isn't history, it's what's left after history forgets. 30 royal mysteries, 0 answers, and one cold truth. Power doesn't die, it just disappears. Welcome to 30 unexplained royal mysteries that will make you chill. Before we dive into the first disappearance, take a second to hit subscribe if you're into ancient secrets, royal scandals, and bedtime stories with body counts. You're in the right palace. Also, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your kingdom right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? We're about to time travel, so let's see how far we're all coming from. Tomb of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. It begins, as most good disappearances do, with a legend. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together after the asp, after the dagger, after Egypt fell to Rome. A final act of doomed intimacy, shrouded in incense smoke and imperial shame. A royal tomb built for a queen and her Roman lover, somewhere between myth and masonry. But like so many promises made at the edge of empire, no one has seen it since. Not that they haven't tried. Archaeologists, treasure hunters, mystics, billionaires with a messiah complex, countless, have chased the grave of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, seduced by the idea of finding love's mausoleum. Some point to Taposiris Magna, an ancient temple site west of Alexandria. Others say it must lie beneath the modern city itself, drowned in centuries of sediment, concrete, and political decay. A few insist it was destroyed by time, by war, by design. But here's the catch. No trace of the tomb has ever been found. Not a fragment, not a bone, not even a carved stone slab whispering a royal name. Cleopatra, who called herself the new Isis, who held Egypt in her painted palm, is gone. Completely. No sarcophagus, no canopic jars, no grand funerary mask. Just silence where there should have been pageantry. And yet, the world keeps digging. In 2009, a heavily publicized excavation at Taposiris Magna, led by Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez, sparked international attention. She believed that Cleopatra's tomb might have been built within the temple's sacred architecture. The site offered enough intrigue: shafts and tunnels, sealed doorways, and Greco-Roman symbols carved into the ancient stone. Some coins bearing Cleopatra's likeness turned up, a statue fragment, amulets, even a partial mummy or two. The media practically crowned it a discovery before the tomb was found. Spoiler, it still hasn't been. Still, that didn't stop the wave of speculation, or the conveniently cinematic theories. Cleopatra died with the asp in hand, Mark Antony with a sword in his gut, and their bodies were carried away by loyalists who defied Octavian's wrath. The tomb, supposedly, was permitted by the future Augustus himself, a favor to history or a PR stunt. But did it even happen? Modern scholars have started to question everything. For one, Plutarch was writing over a century after Cleopatra's death. His sources? Likely hearsay, Roman propaganda, or poetic license. Others argue that the very idea of the shared tomb was a literary flourish, not a historical fact. After all, the image of the tragic lovers united in death plays far too neatly into Western romantic obsession, and the archaeological record isn't helping. Despite advanced scanning technology, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and even underwater archaeology, no structure resembling a Ptolemaic royal tomb has been found anywhere near Alexandria. And frankly, the idea that a monument of that scale just disappeared is problematic, unless it was destroyed systematically, thoroughly, and with motive. Let's talk motive. Rome had plenty of reasons to erase Cleopatra. She wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol of resistance, of female power, of foreign rule. She was the last of her dynasty, the last ruler of an independent Egypt. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, needed to control the narrative. In Roman propaganda, Cleopatra was recast not as a sovereign monarch, but as a manipulative seductress, the wicked witch of the Nile who corrupted noble Antony. In that version of history, she deserved oblivion. So maybe, just maybe, she got it. Not just politically, physically. But then there's the counter-argument. If Rome wanted her erased, why allow a tomb at all? There's a deeper, stranger theory, that her tomb was never meant to be found, not by accident, not by decay, but by design. An act of disappearance worthy of a queen who styled herself a goddess. Some believe Cleopatra chose to vanish, to take her final resting place out of reach, out of time. A buried riddle, a vanishing act, a royal legacy encrypted in sand. This version paints her not as a victim of erasure, but as the architect of her own myth. After all, she had played politics like a chessboard, mastered multiple languages, and held empires at bay with a glance. She knew what memory could do, how forgetting could be a kind of power. And so maybe her tomb is not just lost, it is hidden. But then again, maybe it never existed at all. We circle the same questions like vultures around a mirage. Was she buried at Taposiris Magna, beneath the drowned streets of Alexandria, in a tomb obliterated by centuries of conquest, or in some secluded corner of Egypt, lost beneath shifting sands and untranslatable grief? The problem isn't just the lack of evidence, it's the overabundance of desire. Everyone wants Cleopatra to be somewhere, anywhere. Preferably somewhere that can be photographed, filmed, funded, and mythologized all over again. But the truth remains, the woman who made herself a goddess may have chosen to be remembered by absence, not monument. And if the ancient queen of Egypt really did vanish into the earth with her Roman lover by her side, then perhaps she understood something we still don't, that some mysteries should stay buried. Still, she wasn't the only queen to disappear without a trace. Just ask her distant predecessor, a woman whose painted eyes still gaze across 3,000 years of silence. Her name was Nefertiti, and after year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, she was gone. Nefertiti's fate. She was beautiful, or at least that's what history decided. The famous bust-high cheekbones, elegant neck, almond-shaped eyes became one of the most iconic images in all of archaeology. A face frozen in idealized grace, now sitting in a Berlin museum like an exiled ghost. But here's the rub. We don't know how she died. We don't know where she's buried. And for a woman so famous she only needs one name, Nefertiti, that's not just an oversight, that's a warning. Her name means the beautiful one has come. She arrived like a myth, married the heretic Pharaoh Akhenaten, and together they launched one of the strangest religious experiments in ancient history. Forget the gods, they said. Forget Amun, Osiris, Thoth. There is only Aten the sun disk, a blazing, impersonal deity who didn't walk among humans or fight off crocodile demons in the underworld. Just a radiant orb shining above the desert, demanding exclusive devotion. This was monotheism before Moses, before Christ, before the word monotheism even existed. And right there beside Akhenaten stood Nefertiti, More than just queen consort, she was depicted as nearly equal in size, stature, and sacred power. In some art, she's shown smiting enemies. In others, worshipping Aten alone. She wasn't a royal ornament. She was a ruler, possibly even a co-regent. Then, in year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, she vanishes. Poof! No funeral stelae, no tomb inscriptions, no mummy, no body. The historical record simply closes its mouth and refuses to speak. Now, to be clear, people don't just vanish from ancient history unless someone wants them to. This is where the theories multiply like sandflies on a Nile flood. Some say she died in year 12, perhaps from plague, childbirth, assassination, or divine burnout. Others argue she lived longer, even took power after Akhenaten's death, ruling as the mysterious pharaoh Smenkhare, a king who appeared suddenly, ruled briefly, and left behind nothing but confusion. Let's talk about Smenkhare. He shows up in inscriptions in the final years of the Amarna period, sometimes as co-regent, sometimes solo. But here's the thing, scholars can't even agree on Smenkhare's gender. Was he Akhenaten's younger brother, a son, a political stand-in? Or was he she, Nefertiti, in disguise, wielding male authority in a patriarchal world? It wouldn't be the first time an Egyptian queen took on male royal titles. Hatshepsut did it a century earlier, so why not Nefertiti? Especially if the political situation after Akhenaten's death required continuity, a soft reboot of a collapsing regime. But this raises more questions than it answers. If Nefertiti was Smenkhare, then where is the tomb? Why no monument, no legacy? Why was her name scrubbed from some records but not others? Why the ambiguity? And if she wasn't Smenkhare, if she died earlier, then why is there no trace of that either? Theories get darker. Was she murdered in a palace coup, eliminated by religious conservatives trying to claw their gods back into power? Or more tantalizingly, did she orchestrate her own erasure, the way her stepson Tutankhamun later erased Akhenaten's entire legacy? Imagine that. Nefertiti, watching her husband's theocratic empire unravel, seeing Aten worship falter, the people whispering old gods' names in secret. Perhaps she chose political survival over immortality, buried her past, buried herself, literally. Speaking of burial, there's the theory that refuses to die, that Nefertiti lies hidden in Tutankhamun's tomb. In 2015, radar scans of KV-62, the Boy King's famous burial chamber, suggested possible hidden doorways. The theory was that the tomb was a modified version of an earlier structure, hastily converted to house Tut after his unexpected death. Nicholas Reeves, an Egyptologist with a flair for narrative, proposed that behind one wall might lie the tomb of Nefertiti untouched, sealed for over 3,000 years. The world held its breath. Then came the conflicting scans. One radar survey said yes, anomalies exist. Another said no solid rock. Egypt's Antiquities Ministry played politics with the data. Funding dried up. The hype withered. But the theory never truly died. It just slipped back into the sand. Because here's the thing, if Nefertiti's tomb has been found, and it is inside Tutankhamun's, then the implications are massive. It would rewrite the Amarna period, confirm her co-regency or rule, possibly even offer the first royal female burial to survive intact. But if the tomb doesn't exist, if she lies elsewhere, or nowhere at all, then we're back to staring at a bust in a foreign museum and pretending it's enough. Let's not forget, the bust itself has no inscription, no name. It was found in the studio of the sculptor Thutmose, and for all its haunting beauty, it tells us nothing. It's an image, not a fact. A symbol of presence that proves nothing about where she went. And that, really, is the cruel genius of Nefertiti's mystery. She is everywhere in the art of her time, painted, sculpted, praised, yet entirely absent from history's endnotes. A woman turned into a myth, then a phantom, then a riddle carved in limestone. It's possible that her fate was sealed by politics, that her disappearance was deliberate, state-sponsored, the ancient equivalent of being scrubbed from Wikipedia. But it's equally possible that she vanished by chance, died without fanfare, buried in a lost tomb, and simply fell victim to time's indifference. Whichever version you choose, the end result is the same: a powerful queen who rewrote the rules of Egyptian royalty only to be erased mid-sentence. A ruler whose life remains a question mark flanked by pyramids. Still, there's one thing we do know. Tutankhamun followed her, perhaps as her son, perhaps as her successor. His name means living image of Amun, a not-so-subtle rejection of the sun disk and everything Nefertiti and Akhenaten had built. And yet, his legacy isn't any clearer. His tomb was full, but his story was hollow. Even now, we don't know how he died. But of course, everyone has a theory. How Tutankhamun died. He wasn't supposed to be famous. Tutankhamun, born Tutankhaten, mind you, was a minor king by every metric that mattered. Young, fragile, and politically neutered, he ruled for barely a decade in one of Egypt's most chaotic periods. No great wars, no towering monuments, no flood-defying feats of engineering, just a boy king with brittle bones and a dozen advisors breathing down his neck. And yet, he became the most famous pharaoh of all time. Not because of how he lived, but because of what he left behind: a tomb, mostly intact, glittering with impossible wealth and more curses than answers. When Howard Carter opened it in 1922, it wasn't just Egyptology that changed. It was the global imagination. Suddenly, everyone had Tut fever. Gold masks, jackal statues, scarabs, cartouches, and that face-black eyeliner, regal brows, dead eyes wide open. But behind all that gold lay a frail skeleton, and that skeleton has haunted modern science for a century, because no one knows how he died. You'd think a royal death would be well documented, but Tutankhamun ruled during what we now call the Amarna hangover, a period where Egypt was trying very hard to forget its own recent history. His predecessor and likely father, Akhenaten, had thrown the kingdom into theological chaos by ditching the traditional gods and worshipping the sun disk Aten. When Tut took the throne, Egypt was basically in recovery mode, dragging its shattered priesthood and fractured bureaucracy back into something resembling order. Tut, or rather his handlers, reversed the Aten revolution. His name was changed to honor Amun instead of Aten. Old temples were reopened. Propaganda was scrubbed. The new pharaoh had one job: make Egypt normal again. And then he died. At age 19, let's just lay out the body, literally. When Tutankhamun's mummy was first unwrapped in 1925, it was already in bad shape, damaged by the resin used in his burial, cracked from ancient mishandling, and maybe even burnt in his own sarcophagus. Yes, that's a thing. He might have spontaneously combusted in his tomb, sort of. Despite this mess, several attempts have been made to figure out how he died. Theories abound. 1. Infection from a broken leg. CT scans showed that Tut had a major fracture in his left femur. Some said it looked like a compound break, painful, sudden, possibly the result of a fall or chariot accident. If it became infected, that could have killed him in days. But was it caused before or after death? The embalming process wasn't exactly gentle, and the damage could be post-mortem. 2. Malaria. In 2010, DNA studies suggested he had malaria. Multiple strains, in fact. Combined with his weak immune system, this could have been the tipping point. But again, malaria's symptoms don't fossilize. We're reading viruses into a corpse that's been marinating in resin for 3,000 years. 3. Genetic illness. Let's talk about the royal gene pool. Tut's family tree is basically a tumbleweed. His parents were siblings. His wife was also his half-sister. His own daughter's 2 stillborn mummies were likely the result of devastating genetic defects. CT scans showed that Tut had a clubfoot, a curved spine, and necrosis in his bones. Some say he needed a cane to walk, others say he could barely stand. Add all this together and you get a tragic image. A teenage ruler racked by congenital disease, living in an age of political turmoil and ancient medicine. Death may not have come as a shock. But still, no single theory holds up without cracks. The broken leg could be post-mortem. The malaria, plausible, but not definitive. The genetic defects, real, but not necessarily fatal by 19. And then, of course, come the fringe theories. Was he murdered? Political assassinations are an old Egyptian hobby. Maybe his advisors got tired of the bloodline. Maybe he was a pawn in someone else's game and outlived his usefulness. After all, his vizier became pharaoh immediately after Tut's death and married his widow. Coincidence? History's full of convenient marriages. Or maybe it was an accident, a chariot crash, as some Egyptologists once claimed, though that doesn't line up with the evidence. A sickly boy with a clubfoot riding in a war chariot sounds more like bad fan fiction than reality. The tragedy of Tutankhamun is that he's a symbol without substance. He didn't conquer, he didn't build, he didn't endure, but he died. And the world, quite literally, opened his grave. All of this speculation is because death, when it comes to kings, isn't allowed to be mundane. A fractured leg and a fever don't satisfy the myth. They don't scratch the itch of mystery. The world wants murder, drama, curses, ancient vengeance. But sometimes death is just sad, arbitrary, anatomical. Still, Tut wasn't the only ruler swallowed by history. Some kings vanish so completely, their names echo like thunder with no lightning. Take Genghis Khan, for instance, a man who conquered the largest land empire in human history. You'd think they'd at least know where he's buried. They don't. The lost tomb of Genghis Khan. He died on a horse. That's one version. Another says he was thrown from it. Some whisper he fell in battle. Others suggest internal injuries from an accident or wounds from a revenge killing struck down not by an army, but by a woman he tried to take. Or perhaps, most fittingly, no one knows at all. Genghis Khan, the man who made empires bleed, vanished into the earth with no final image, no imperial portrait, no grave to honor or defile. The most powerful man of the 13th century left behind an empire that would reshape the world, but took his body with him into oblivion. There is something unnervingly symmetrical about that. Genghis Khan conquered over 12 million square miles of territory. An empire larger than Rome, larger than Alexander's, larger than any before or since. From the frozen plains of Siberia to the walls of Hungary, from the Pacific Ocean to the Persian Gulf, his armies rode like thunder, burning cities, toppling dynasties, and rerouting the very shape of the world. Entire civilizations adjusted to his presence or were ground under it. And then he died. In 1227, somewhere in the region of Western Sia, the great Khan stopped breathing. His sons were summoned, his banners lowered, but the mourning, like the death, was hushed, controlled, veiled in secrecy. According to Mongol tradition, and here's where history starts to slip into ritual, his funeral procession returned home, carrying his body in complete silence. Soldiers killed any witnesses they encountered along the way. Herds of horses trampled the burial site to erase the landscape. Some stories claim a river was diverted over the grave. Others say an entire forest was planted to hide it. One version even claims the 800 soldiers who buried him were executed by another set of 800, who were themselves killed afterward to protect the secret. It's murder by mathematics, logistics as legend. And what's more unsettling, it might have worked. Despite centuries of searching, no confirmed tomb of Genghis Khan has ever been found. No royal sarcophagus, no carved inscriptions, no golden death mask glinting under torchlight. Nothing. Only whispers. Modern archaeologists have hunted it with everything short of divination. A site in Kenti province, near the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, has drawn attention. Some argue that the location matches traditional accounts. Others suggest the I.H. Burke Fortress, or the Onon River Valley. There have been satellite scans, drone surveys, ground-penetrating radar, and wild goose chase expeditions funded by shadowy billionaire adventurists. All have failed. Why? Because Mongolian culture, even now, holds the tomb sacred not just as a historical site, but as a metaphysical one. Many believe it should never be disturbed. That to dig there is to violate not just a grave, but a cosmic order. Genghis wasn't just a ruler. He was the sky's wrath, the will of Tengri incarnate. He was buried not as a man, but as a myth. There is also a national interest in keeping the mystery intact. The ambiguity feeds into the larger story of Mongol identity. If the tomb were found, the legend might shrink. It might become a tourist attraction. A sanitized ruin with an entrance fee, a selfie backdrop, better to let him lie in sacred obscurity. And then there's the cynical angle. Maybe the tomb was found already. Looted. Destroyed. The body lost to time. The site paved over. The location unrecognizable beneath centuries of geological rearrangement. Earth doesn't preserve legends out of sentimentality. It swallows them, decomposes them, and forgets. But what's really disturbing, what keeps archaeologists and dreamers up at night, is the scale of intentional disappearance. To hide a tomb is one thing. To erase the most important person of your civilization is another. It means someone made that decision. Someone planned the forgetting. And they succeeded. What does it mean to kill memory? In an age where rulers carve their names into mountains, build glass towers in their own honor, and install statues on every street corner, Genghis Khan chose anonymity, or someone chose it for him. His empire was carved in blood across 3 continents, but his death was swallowed by silence. And maybe that's the final act of conquest. To remove yourself so completely that even history can't reach you. To become not a skeleton in a tomb, but an absence that haunts. We keep searching because we're not looking for his bones. We're looking for an anchor, a way to close the book, to say, here he is. This was the man. But history refuses to oblige. The man who built the largest empire in history is a ghost buried in an idea. And in that idea, he becomes untouchable. But while the tomb of Genghis Khan may have vanished from sight, another emperor's remains lie tantalizingly close, just a mound, really, in the center of China. So close we can see it. So vast, it dwarfs even the Great Pyramid. And yet no one dares to open it. Inside, Qin Shi Huang's unopened tomb. It's not a tomb. It's a warning label carved into the earth. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, died in 210 BCE, but he hasn't really left. His mausoleum still sits beneath a man-made hill in Shanxi province, rising like a mute volcano above farmland and urban sprawl. It's the kind of place that seems deceptively ordinary until you remember what's underneath. This isn't a grave, it's a buried apocalypse. The outer portions have been touched. You know the part. The terracotta army, those ranks of stone soldiers unearthed by startled farmers in 1974. Thousands of them, frozen mid-March, each face unique, carved with eerie precision. They were only the guards, the welcome committee, a deterrent to grave robbers and archaeologists alike. The real tomb, the inner chamber, is still sealed, untouched. Not because no one can open it, but because no one dares. Let's rewind. Qin Shi Huang was a man obsessed with permanence. He conquered warring states and stitched them together, with laws, roads, scripts, and blood. He burned books, buried scholars alive, built the early Great Wall, fought mortality like it was just another rebel province. And when death finally caught him, he made sure his exit would look like a conquest too. The ancient historian Sima Qian wrote that the emperor's tomb was built with rivers of mercury flowing through model palaces, mountains, and lakes. The ceiling, allegedly, was inlaid with precious stones, mimicking the stars. Traps and crossbows were installed to fire at intruders. It was an entire kingdom buried alive, a simulation of power so elaborate it became indistinguishable from madness. And here's the kicker. Modern soil tests around the site show unusually high mercury levels. So maybe it wasn't all metaphor. Maybe there really is a miniature China beneath that mound, flooded with toxic metal, locked away behind traps and curses and 2 millennia of paranoia. You'd think this would make the Chinese government eager to investigate, but the official stance has been one of cautious reverence. The tomb, they say, is too fragile to excavate safely. The technology to preserve what's inside once opened simply doesn't exist yet. And fair enough, the last time we cracked open an ancient tomb without a plan, we ended up cooking Tutankhamun in his own resin. Still, that hasn't stopped speculation. Is it a death chamber full of poison gas, an emperor's brainchild designed to outlive humanity? Or is it empty, a propaganda bluff, a tomb as symbolic as the empire it once anchored? And the traps, always the traps. Crossbows rigged to shoot automatically, pressure plates buried under false floors, mechanical nightmares lost to time. Sounds absurd, right? But consider who we're talking about. This is the man who standardized coinage, axle widths, and writing systems in a single lifetime. Who demanded alchemists deliver him immortality potions and swallowed mercury until it killed him. He wasn't just paranoid, he was visionary, delusional, deadly. So maybe those traps are real. Maybe somewhere beneath that hill, a 2000-year-old mechanism is still cocked, still ready, still waiting for the wrong breath of air. The moral calculus gets slippery here. On one hand, we crave knowledge. We want to see inside the tomb, solve the puzzle, demystify the myth. On the other hand, opening it might destroy the very thing we're trying to preserve. Would it collapse? Would it leak toxins? Would the mercury turn the tomb into a chemical death trap? Or worse, what if we open it and find nothing? No rivers, no stars, no emperor on a jade throne, just damp stone, looted centuries ago, or a fraud of imperial proportions. The whole story could be a mausoleum-sized bluff, but it's the not knowing that gives it power. The unopened tomb is more terrifying than anything we could dig up. It's Schrödinger's sarcophagus. Until we open it, it holds both the greatest archaeological discovery of all time and absolutely nothing. Which, of course, makes it irresistible. The urge to open it is primal. We want to look death in the face. We want to see how power dreams of eternity. We want to stand at the center of a machine built to make a man immortal. But China has left the tomb sealed, for now. Maybe because it's sacred. Maybe because it's unstable. Maybe because some secrets really do keep themselves. Still, the emperor left more than just a Mercury river behind. He was buried with an object even more symbolic, more mysterious, and even more lost to time. It was said to be the soul of the empire, a jade stamp of divine authority, the heirloom seal of the realm. And, unlike the tomb, it's not buried, it's just gone. China's lost heirloom seal of the realm. A square of jade, roughly 10 centimeters across, carved with 9 characters that simply read, "Having received the mandate of heaven, may the emperor lead a long and prosperous life." Simple, poetic. The kind of inscription that sounds ceremonial at first until you realize it wasn't just a royal motto. It was a divine license, a metaphysical signature. This was the heirloom seal of the realm. And for nearly 1,000 years, it was the cornerstone of imperial legitimacy in China. No conquest was truly complete without it. No emperor fully sanctioned until it rested in his hand. Dynasties claimed it, killed for it, forged copies of it, and wrote entire histories around it. And now? It's gone. No one knows where it is. No one knows when exactly it vanished. And worse, no one's even sure how much of what we think we know about it is real. Let's rewind to the beginning. The seal was supposedly carved from the hishebi, a legendary piece of jade so pure and luminous that entire kingdoms went to war over it. The jade was gifted after much political drama to the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, around 221 BCE. He had it carved with the now famous inscription and declared it the central symbol of his divine right to rule. From that moment, the seal wasn't just a political token. It was the mandate of heaven materialized. Whoever held it was no mere king. He was heaven's chosen. Lose the seal, and you didn't just lose office, you lost cosmic favor, which made it kind of awkward that so many emperors misplaced it. Over the next centuries, it passed from hand to bloodied hand. Through civil wars, betrayals, and the rise and fall of dynasties, the seal became both trophy and curse. It was said to bring legitimacy to its owner and doom to anyone unworthy of it, which, judging by how many short-lived dynasties tried and failed to hold on to it, was apparently most of them. At various points, it was dropped, stolen, chipped, or deliberately melted down and recast, though only unsuccessfully, of course, according to imperial records. Because you can't just remake heaven's will in a new shape. That's not how cosmic bureaucracy works. The Han dynasty claimed it, then the Three Kingdoms, then the Jin, and on it went each ruler clutching the seal as if it were a divine grenade pin. Its absence during a transition of power could trigger mass doubt, even rebellion. But somewhere in the chaos of China's fracturing empires, it vanished. Some say it was lost during the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a century of warlords, puppet emperors, and shattered unity. Others claim it was gone much earlier, and later dynasties simply lied, forging replicas and writing it back into their legitimacy after the fact. The Song dynasty may have never seen the real thing. The Ming, probably holding a fake. The Qing claimed to have several authentic seals, which is, suspicious. And yet they all spoke of it in reverent tones, as if even pretending to possess the heirloom seal gave them some spectral authority, a kind of political ghostwriting by heaven itself. It gets weirder. No surviving object has ever been verified as the original seal. Museums in China and Taiwan have collections of imperial seals, some exquisite, some ancient, but none conclusively matches the descriptions of the heirloom seal. Most are clearly from later dynasties. Some are artistic commemorations, others are complete forgeries. So, what happened to it? One theory suggests it was lost during a siege thrown into a well, perhaps, to keep it from falling into enemy hands. Another says it was deliberately destroyed by a crumbling regime unwilling to let their successors claim divine favor. There's even the idea that it was buried with an emperor in secret, lost in a tomb that no one dares to open, which, seems to be a pattern. But the real question might not be where it is. It might be why it was allowed to disappear. Because as dynasties modernized, as China's concept of legitimacy shifted from heavenly mandate to bureaucratic power, maybe the seal lost its magic. Maybe the idea of a divine stamp felt embarrassing, like carrying a dead phone that used to control the weather. Maybe heaven got tired of co-signing every throne. Still, it lingers in the imagination. A tiny square of jade with the power to crown emperors and dethrone impostors, lost to time, or hidden, or buried beneath 1,000 years of political embarrassment. Whatever the case, the heirloom seal remains one of the most symbolically loaded objects never found, a royal relic that promised cosmic order and delivered centuries of chaos. But China's imperial mysteries don't stop with objects. Some disappearances are even more personal. Like an emperor who vanished so completely after being overthrown that he might have spent the rest of his life as a monk or a ghost. The vanished Jianwen Emperor. His reign lasted 4 years. His disappearance has lasted 6 centuries. Zhu Yunwen, better known by his imperial title, the Jianwen Emperor, was the second ruler of the Ming dynasty, but in the official records, he's little more than a hiccup. A transitional shadow between his grandfather, the dynasty's founder, and his uncle, who staged a coup and rewrote the family tree to pretend Jianwen never ruled at all. Now, the curious thing is not that he was overthrown. That's practically a rite of passage for Chinese emperors. The mystery lies in what happened after, because in July of the year 1402, as flames consumed the imperial palace in Nanjing, the 19-year-old emperor simply disappeared. Poof! No confirmed body, no grave, no execution announcement, not even a smug victory plaque from the man who deposed him. Just ash, hearsay, and a suspicious number of monks. Let's back up. The Ming dynasty had only recently been born from the wreckage of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty. Zhu Yuanzhang, the first Ming emperor and Jianwen's grandfather, rose from peasant roots to forge an empire. He was brutal, paranoid, and effective traits he did not entirely pass down to his grandson. Jianwen came to the throne at 17, determined to civilize the court and curtail the power of his own uncles, who had been given princely titles and vast military command. The most dangerous of these was the Prince of Yanzudi, who controlled the north and had spent years building his army in Beijing while pretending to play nice. When Jianwen started arresting his relatives, Zhu Di took it personally. He launched the Jingnan Rebellion in 1399. For 3 years, North and South waged a civil war that was, on paper, about family order, but in reality was a contest of survival. In 1402, Zhu Di marched into Nanjing. The palace caught fire. Jianwen, his empress, and his crown prince were said to have perished in the flames, but no remains were recovered. Zhu Di took the throne as the Yongle Emperor. He declared the Jianwen era illegitimate, ordered every official record of his nephew's reign destroyed, had monks, historians, and former loyalists executed or re-educated. He was so thorough that for a while, even mentioning Jianwen's name could be seen as a subversive act. And yet, rumors flourished. The most persistent claimed that Jianwen had shaved his head, put on robes, and escaped the palace inferno by becoming a Buddhist monk. That he wandered China in secret, hiding among the temples and monasteries like a royal phantom in saffron. That he lived out his days reciting sutras instead of edicts, watched by heaven but invisible to history. The Yongle emperor, paranoid as ever, seemed to take the rumors seriously. He ordered secret agents and emissaries to scour the country's temples for suspicious monks, arrested and interrogated abbot after abbot. Monastic life during Yonglei's reign became a risky business. But still no captured emperor, no corpse, just echoes. Even decades later, reports surfaced of old monks claiming to be the deposed emperor. One such figure, appearing during the reign of Yongle's grandson, was treated with shocking dignity, suggesting that parts of the court might have quietly believed him, or wanted to believe, or feared that heaven had left an heir in disguise, waiting for karmic justice. Which leads us to a rather unsettling possibility, that the empire knew he was alive and let him be. It's a peculiar arrangement, isn't it? A dead emperor who isn't dead, and a living emperor who needs the myth of death to remain secure. So Jianwen becomes a sort of Schrödinger's ruler, alive in whispers, dead in the archives. The imperial court even flirted with rehabilitating his legacy long after Yonglei's death. During the southern Ming resistance against the Qing dynasty, Jianwen's story was revived as a symbol of righteous loss, of dynastic betrayal, and moral legitimacy. A tragic figure who had been too noble, too passive, too gentle for the throne and was crushed for it. And perhaps that's the real core of the mystery. Jianwen wasn't just erased, he was erased well. Not in a moment of violence, but through narrative manipulation, historiographic surgery, and spiritual rumor. He became a kind of anti-legend. No mausoleum, no name on a stele. Just a whisper of imperial defeat, walking barefoot among the monks, pretending not to be history. We don't know if he died in the fire or fled into the forest. We don't know if he meditated to death in a remote temple, or if he was quietly murdered years later to tie up loose ends. We only know he disappeared. But China isn't the only island of imperial secrets. Travel further east, and you'll find a royal lineage that's even more secretive. One still alive today, still cloaked in ceremony and mystery. They have treasures no one is allowed to see. And one of those treasures might not even be real. Japan's 3 sacred treasures. There are relics you can see in a museum, weathered, glass-cased, illuminated just right so you forget they're actually dead. And then there are relics that remain unseen, untouched, and unverified for over 1,000 years, while still claiming to prop up an entire civilization. Japan chose the second kind. The imperial regalia of Japan, also known as the 3 sacred treasures, consist of a sword, a mirror, and a jewel. Supposedly. No one outside a tiny circle of cloistered priests and imperial insiders has seen all 3, and those who have, they don't talk. Officially, these items symbolize the very foundation of Japanese rule: valor, the sword, wisdom, the mirror, and benevolence, the jewel. But unofficially, they symbolize something far more provocative: control without evidence. They are the core of Japan's monarchy, and no one can prove they exist. Let's start with the legend. According to myth, the sun goddess Amaterasu, founder of the imperial line, gifted the treasures to her grandson Ninigi when he descended from the heavens to rule the earth. In other words, the very first imperial assignment came with a 3-part starter kit. Here's your weapon, your soul, and your self-reflection. Try not to lose them. Over the centuries, these objects were said to be passed from emperor to emperor as divine proof of legitimacy. No regalia, no throne. Now here's the thing. Japan's emperors didn't always have the regalia, and they certainly didn't always possess power. The shoguns ruled for centuries while emperors prayed, painted poetry, and politely pretended to be in charge. But the regalia, they endured. They became symbols that outlasted actual authority. If the emperor couldn't govern, at least the regalia could remind people that, once upon a time, the gods said he could. And so the objects became more than heirlooms. They became metaphysical hostages. Each item has its own story, riddled with gaps and suspicions. The sword Kusanagi no Tsurugi is said to have been pulled from the body of an 8-headed dragon. That's not metaphor, that's the actual origin story. It was discovered by the storm god Susanoo, handed down like a divine USB drive, and eventually stored at Atsuta Shrine. That's the claim, at least. But here's where it gets murky. In 1185, during the Genpei War, the imperial family fled by boat and reportedly threw the sword into the sea at the Battle of Dan no Ura to keep it from falling into enemy hands. Did it sink? Was it recovered? Did they forge a copy and pretend everything was fine? Shrines claim the sword exists today. No one's allowed to verify. Then there's the mirror Yata no Kagami. Allegedly housed at Ise Grand Shrine, it's supposed to be a replica of the mirror used to lure Amaterasu out of her cave, bringing light back to the world. In some versions, the original mirror is still buried at Ise, sealed from human eyes, and the one used in imperial ceremonies is a replica, or maybe the replica's replica. We honestly don't know. Again, secrecy is the point. And the jewel Yasakani no Magatama is perhaps the most plausible of the three. A curved comma-shaped bead, likely from ancient Jomon culture, and the only item people generally agree physically exists. It's stored at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, passed down through coronations like a mystical USB drive. But even here, there are no photographs, no independent inspections, just tradition, oral repetition, and a very firm no comment. When the emperor ascends the throne, the regalia are presented, not displayed, not opened, not verified. They're wrapped in cloth, carried by priests, and shown to him in a private ceremony with zero public transparency. Imagine being handed the keys to heaven in a shoebox you're never allowed to open. That's the Japanese coronation. This opacity isn't an accident. It's the foundation. The regalia work because no one can confirm them. They exist in a space of sacred abstraction, Schrödinger's relics. If the public ever saw them and found them mundane, fake, or missing, the illusion of divine lineage might collapse. Or worse, it might survive stripped of mystery, reduced to theatre. So instead, they remain hidden, more potent for never being seen. The Japanese monarchy is the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy in the world. But the truth is, it survives not on visibility, but on suggestion. It is a structure built on myth, ritual, and absence. The treasures are at the center of that absence, silently screaming legitimacy through silence. And what happens when you lose one? Well, Japan may already know, because if the sword was really lost at Dan no Ura in 1185, then everything we've seen since has been a performance, a delicate, unbroken lie, a ritualistic sleight of hand, reverent, national, almost holy. And that sword? It may still be underwater, or not, which leads us to a battle, a sea. A drowning boy emperor clutching a blade that may or may not have survived. And one of the strangest disappearances in Japan's imperial memory. Did the sacred sword sink at Dan no Ura? The boy emperor was 6 years old, dressed in robes too heavy for his frame, crowned with authority far older than his life, far beyond his understanding. His name was Emperor Antoku, child of the Taira clan, an imperial pawn in a war that had already decided his fate, long before he could read his own name. On the 25th of April, 1185, his navy faced the Minamoto forces in the narrow strait of Dan no Yura, where the inland sea of Japan funnels into something sharp and brutal. The water churned with prophecy and betrayal. The battle didn't last long. And as the tide turned literally, as the current shifted in favor of the Minamoto fleet, the Empress Dowager wrapped herself and her grandson in ceremonial robes and jumped into the sea. But not before she made sure to take the regalia with her. That's the story, anyway. Because the three sacred treasures, those elusive, mostly invisible artifacts we already don't get to see, weren't just ceremonial. They were spiritual keys to the Japanese throne. The sword Kusanagi was the centerpiece. Not just a weapon, but a divine signature passed down from gods to emperors. A blade born in myth, legitimized in ritual, and carried aboard the ship like a divine hostage. And then, according to tradition, it sank. Except did it? That's the question that's been hanging over the Imperial line ever since. The official story says the sword was lost in the sea when Antoku drowned. That it was either taken to the ocean floor by loyalists or slipped from panicked hands and vanished beneath the waves. One version even claims it was cursed to sink to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Another suggests it wasn't even real. The sword on board was a copy, a decoy, the real one hidden safely elsewhere in anticipation of defeat. All we know for certain is this: the Minamoto forces didn't get the sword. But here's the strange part. Not long after the battle, the imperial family declared that the sword had been restored. No explanation, no details. Just a quiet institutional shrug and a ceremonial continuation of everything that came before. The ritual resumed. The coronations went on. The imperial authority flowed like nothing had happened. But the object at the center of it, this talisman of divine inheritance, had been replaced, or retrieved, or replicated, or forgotten. And no one said a word. Because that's how power works when it's built on narrative, not proof. The sacred sword today, if it exists, is allegedly housed at Atsuta Shrine, but no outsider has seen it, no scholar has studied it, no government has verified it, and no official has ever acknowledged whether it's the same blade that sank at Dan no Yura, or whether there ever was a blade at all. Here's the deeper unease. If the sword was truly lost, and if the object now being revered is a facsimile or forgery, then the entire mythology of imperial continuity has been at least symbolically compromised. But no one will admit that. Because this isn't just a missing object, it's a philosophical threat, a ghost inside a national dream, and dreams, as any power structure will tell you, are best left uninterrupted. Which is why the sword was never officially declared lost. It was just restored. Like a corrupted file you pretend never glitched. You close the window, restart the machine, and carry on as if nothing happened. Because to do otherwise would be to question the very nature of heaven's favor. And that's not a conversation you want to have with a divine monarchy. So maybe the sword still lies at the bottom of the sea, covered in barnacles and divine silence. Or maybe it never left its shrine. Or maybe, in a twist befitting a nation of elegant illusions, the sword is less important than the belief in the sword. But that's not the only imperial artifact tied to sacred identity and contested presence. Travel further west to a land of highlands and incense, where another monarchy once claimed descent not from gods, but from biblical royalty. And at the center of that claim sits a box, untouchable, unseeable, unverifiable. They call it the Ark, Ark of the Covenant and the Solomonic line. It's the kind of claim that sounds like something whispered at the edge of a conspiracy theory convention. That a wooden box, gold-plated, thunderous, holy, rests not in Jerusalem, nor in Rome, nor in some Indiana Jones warehouse, but in a dark chapel in Ethiopia, and that it has been there for nearly 3,000 years. The Ark of the Covenant, yes, that Ark is said to sit within the Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion, in the northern Ethiopian city of Axum, guarded by a single monk who may never leave the grounds, never see another human face, and never confirm to anyone whether the object he's watching is the real thing. There is no tour. There are no photos. There is only silence. And here's the more staggering part. Ethiopia's imperial lineage rested entirely on the assumption that this claim is true. This isn't just an Old Testament curiosity that wandered out of the Bible and got lost in Africa. This is the foundation of an entire monarchy, a political theology claiming that the Ethiopian royal line descended directly from King Solomon of Israel through his union with the Queen of Sheba. The story goes like this. The Queen of Sheba, known as Makeda in Ethiopian tradition, visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. They had a child, Menelik III, who was raised in Ethiopia but travelled to Jerusalem as a young man to meet his father. Upon returning home, he was accompanied by the sons of Israelite nobles, and, depending on which version of the legend you prefer, the Ark of the Covenant, either taken deliberately or spirited away by divine command. Menelik didn't ask permission. God, allegedly, didn't mind. And thus, the Ark carrier of divine law, the very presence of God on earth, left its biblical homeland and took up permanent residence in Africa. To accept this version of history is to accept that the Ethiopian imperial family wasn't just royal, it was divinely royal, legitimated by the same authority that once struck down Philistines and whispered commands to Moses. This is no minor claim. It means the Solomonic dynasty was not just ancient, but chosen. And it endured. From roughly the 13th century to 1974, Ethiopian emperors leaned on this narrative like it was carved in stone. The Ark, hidden in its chapel, wasn't just a relic. It was the crown's theological anchor. And when Haile Selassie ruled as the last emperor of that line, he wasn't just a political figure, he was, in the eyes of many, a continuation of sacred history. That belief, of course, stretched far beyond Ethiopia's borders. In the Caribbean, the Rastafari movement deified Selassie as the returned Messiah. For millions, Ethiopia became Zion. Not metaphorically, literally. And still, at the center of this millennia-spanning chain of belief sits a box no one is allowed to see. Attempts to verify the Ark's presence in Axum have always collapsed into the same wall. No access, no evidence, no confirmation. The guardian monk refuses to show it. His role is lifelong. When he dies, another is chosen. He is the Ark's witness and its prisoner. His health is said to decline under its divine radiation. His eyes dim, his body weakens, but he never leaves his post. The building itself is modest, unassuming, guarded, yes, but hardly the fortress one might expect for housing an object of cosmic fury. And yet, despite being unverifiable, the claim endures. Because this is not about archaeology, it's about sacred narrative. The Ark's power, like the sword of Kusanagi or the heirloom seal of China, thrives in its invisibility. Once seen, it risks becoming mundane. As long as it's hidden, it's infinite. And yet, if it's not there, if it's just a tradition built on faith and nothing more, then an entire royal theology teeters on a phantom. Which is exactly why no one opens the box. Because the truth would be too costly, whatever it is. Belief is too old. too intertwined with national identity, too woven into the fabric of imperial legitimacy. So, the ark remains? Maybe, maybe not. But it remains. And so does the question, what happens when that theology collapses? When divine favor no longer protects the throne? In 1975, Haile Selassie died under murky circumstances. A dethroned emperor, a toppled god, no state funeral, no closure, just silence, once again, around a royal body no one was supposed to touch. Haile Selassie's death. The Lion of Judah died in a basement. That's the version you won't find etched on any royal obelisk. No marble statues commemorating his final hour, no epic elegy for the man once hailed as the King of Kings, elect of God, the 225th direct descendant of Solomon and Sheba, just a toppled emperor, a crumpled old man smothered in silence under the new regime's boots. At least, that's one version. Because even now, no one agrees on how Haile Selassie really died. The year was 1975. Ethiopia had been bleeding from the inside out for years. Famines ignored, dissent crushed, imperial grandeur rusting under the weight of modern expectations. The revolution had already happened. The Derg, a Marxist military junta, had taken over in 1974 and placed the emperor under house arrest. Except, house makes it sound quaint. What really happened is they locked the 83-year-old emperor in a modest, guarded room within the walls of his former palace, now a prison. For months he was kept in isolation. No visitors, no press, no ceremony. Just daily reports of health checkups from a government that refused to let anyone see him. And then, in August 1975, came the announcement. Haile Selassie was dead. Natural causes, they said. Complications from a prostate operation, they said. And just like that, it was over. But of course, it wasn't, because within hours of the announcement, whispers started slipping through the cracks. Former palace staff and doctors in exile claimed there had been no operation. There had been no illness. There had been no dignified death. Only a murder, a smothering, a pillow pressed against the old emperor's face by Derg officials under cover of night. A state-ordered assassination disguised as a health bulletin. But here's the thing. For nearly 2 decades, there was no body. No grave. No exhumation. No proof. Haile Selassie, who had once addressed the League of Nations, stood beside Churchill and Roosevelt, and became a living god to millions of Rastafarians across the world, had vanished into the soil of a regime that wanted him forgotten. It wasn't until 1992, after the Derg itself collapsed, that a body was quietly recovered from beneath one of the palace's private offices, buried under a latrine. Let that sink in. The man once considered the chosen monarch of Africa's only uncolonized empire was hidden beneath a toilet. The bones were tested, believed to be his, and eventually interred in Addis Ababa's Holy Trinity Cathedral in 2000. A grand funeral was finally held, 25 years late. Heads of state, loyalists, priests, Rastafarian pilgrims all came, but by then, the moment had rotted, the myth had curdled. The emperor had become a ghost of contested memory, saint to some, tyrant to others, a missing person of history walking between divinity and decay. The cause of death remains officially listed as natural. No charges were ever brought, no autopsy released, no confession obtained, just layers of political dust and half-closed case files. What complicates the matter further is that Selassie didn't just rule a country, he was Ethiopia, in the symbolic sense. His divine right to rule was encoded in the myth of the Ark, the Solomonic line, and 3,000 years of dynastic memory. Killing him wasn't just regicide, it was symbolic deicide, a way to decapitate not just the head of state, but the soul of the empire itself. And that's why the Derg tried so hard to erase him. They feared him. Even powerless, even dying, he was a threat. His existence reminded Ethiopia of what had been lost and worse, of what still might be true. Because when myths die, they don't disappear, they haunt. The man who had once defied Mussolini and rallied Pan-African dreams ended his life in silence, his final breath taken, if the rumors are true, by the same hands that replaced crowns with rifles. And yet, his story still refuses to close. Because, just like Selassie's death, another royal end still hangs unresolved, not in Africa, but in the Caucasus Mountains, where a queen's final resting place remains hidden beneath centuries of sacred denial. She ruled kingdoms, defied armies, was canonized a saint, and when she died, she disappeared, Queen Tamar's hidden tomb. She was called king, not queen. Tamar of Georgia, monarch of the High Caucasus during the late 12th and early 13th century, wasn't just royalty. She was empire, sword, and scripture incarnate. A woman so powerful her title shed its gender entirely. A ruler who presided over the Georgian Golden Age like a lion in silk. And yet no one knows where she's buried. No monument, no tombstone. No mausoleum standing solemnly against the mountain winds. For a woman hailed as a living saint, canonized by the church, and glorified in epic poetry for centuries, Queen Tamar left behind an imperial mystery so complete it makes you wonder if she planned it that way. The theories multiply like mountain echoes. Some say she was buried at the Gelati Monastery, a jewel of Georgian medieval architecture that she herself patronized, home to mosaics, liturgical chants, and her father's visible tomb, but not hers. Walk the cloisters, light a candle, stare at centuries-old frescoes, and you won't find Tamar. Others argue for the Vardzia cave monastery, a fortress of tunnels and chapels carved straight into volcanic rock. Legend claims she fled there as enemies invaded and died in the sacred dark, like a monarch entombed inside her own hidden prayer. But no remains, no royal sarcophagus, just the whispered breath of candle smoke on stone. Some claim her body was secretly carried up into the highlands, hidden among the towers of Svaneti, where no one could touch her, not invaders, not grave robbers, not time itself. A monarch turned mountain, silent and eternal. And, of course, there's the grandest theory, that her burial site was deliberately concealed, not just for protection, but as a holy act of erasure. That her grave was meant to vanish, to be known only to God. This idea wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. Tamar ruled at a time of political turbulence and geopolitical chess. She had enemies, foreign and domestic. Her early reign was challenged by nobles who weren't thrilled about taking orders from a woman. Her first husband, a Russ's prince, turned abusive and traitorous. She had him exiled. Then she picked her own second husband, ran her own campaigns, built her own legends. She led crusades. She expanded Georgia's territory from the Black Sea to the Caspian. She outruled most of the men who tried to undermine her, and she did it all with a calmness that made her even more terrifying. Tamar was not a conqueror frothing at the mouth. She ruled with religious legitimacy, composed elegance, and terrifying precision. Georgian chronicles depict her as a fusion of virtue and force, a saint with a sword, cloaked in Byzantine gold and divinely sanctioned authority. So why no tomb? Because death is vulnerability. A body is a risk. In the medieval world, graves were raided, desecrated, or turned into relic trading pits. A saint's remains could become loot. A monarch's tomb could become a symbol for enemies. To be found was to be claimed, and Tamar Queen, King, Holy Mother of Georgia, was too powerful to be claimed. There's another dimension to this: theology. In Georgian Orthodox belief, saints don't always need earthly markers. The sacred is not in the bone, but in the memory. Tamar's sainthood turned her body into something untouchable. If you found it, what would you do? Display it? Prove she was mortal after all? Better that she vanish. Better that her memory float between monasteries, eternal in its absence. This also allowed the church and state to share her legacy without fighting over a corpse. No single place could claim her, all of Georgia could. And so, for 800 years, Tamar has remained unburied and everywhere. Her image appears in churches, history books, icons, currency. Her legacy is everywhere, but her body is nowhere. It's an act of national myth-making so complete it becomes architecture. Her absence has weight. She's a sovereign ghost haunting every chapel, bell and mountain peak. Of course, this isn't the only case of royal vanishing. History has a morbid fondness for hiding monarchs once they become too symbolic, too dangerous, or too complicated to be remembered properly. And if Georgia's queen disappeared into myth, then Romania's most infamous ruler vanished into something darker entirely. A warlord, a vampire prototype, a prince of blood. And no one knows where his body went. Where is Vlad the Impaler buried? The man who inspired Dracula is missing. Not in the literary sense. Not in the he lives forever in nightmares and candlelit castles sense. No, Vlad III, voivode of Wallachia, scourge of the Ottomans, hero to some and horror story to most, is missing in the most literal way possible. They don't know where his body is. The Prince of Spikes, of forests made from impaled corpses, of psychological warfare so grotesque it made invading armies turn back in nausea, has no confirmed tomb. No grave for pilgrims or critics to weep or spit on. No concrete marker where you can place a flower or stake. For a man whose life was one long scream into the throat of history, his afterlife has been disturbingly quiet. Let's rewind. Vlad was born sometime around 1431 in Transylvania, probably in Sighishuara, while his father Vlad II Dracul was serving the Hungarian crown. The Dracul part comes from the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric group founded to defend Christianity against the Ottoman Empire. That makes Vlad III, the son of the dragon, Dracula. He spent his early years as both a prince and a political hostage. As a teenager, he was imprisoned by the Ottomans alongside his brother Radu, an arrangement meant to keep his father loyal. It didn't work. The family disintegrated into betrayal, murder, and palace coups. Vlad eventually clawed his way back to power, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He ruled Wallachia like a man on fire, an unstable frontier state wedged between Christian Hungary and the expanding Islamic Ottoman Empire. His method of governance, fear, fire, and lots of stakes. The most famous account, likely embellished, possibly true, utterly horrifying, describes a forest of 20,000 impaled bodies left rotting outside the city of Targovishte, a grim welcome for an invading Ottoman army. Supposedly, the Sultan turned around. Vlad had made his point, but his reign, for all its terror and myth, was not endless. In 1476, after a series of betrayals and brief reascents to power, Vlad was killed possibly in battle, possibly assassinated. His head was sent to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople, where it was allegedly displayed on a spike. His body? That's where the mystery begins. The most commonly cited burial site is the Snagov Monastery, a quiet island on a lake north of Bucharest. The legend goes that monks risked everything to retrieve his remains and bury him in sanctified ground beneath the church altar, no less. A kind of spiritual insurance policy for a man who had murdered priests and nobles, but claimed to be the hammer of Christendom. Excavations at Snagov in the 20th century found nothing. No body, no grave, just disappointment and empty soil where a tyrant was supposed to lie. Another theory places him at Kamana Monastery, which Vlad himself had built. It would be poetic in a grim Eastern European kind of way. Found your own monastery, rule by impalement, and then vanish into the walls you funded. But again, no proof, no confirmed remains. Bones have been tested, retested, carbon dated. None belong definitively to Vlad III. Then come the weirder rumors. Some say his body was spirited away by loyalists, hidden from desecration by his many enemies. Others claim the Ottomans dumped it in a mass grave, or that his bones were stolen and used in occult rituals by the kind of people who own too many candles and not enough light bulbs. And of course, there's the inevitable vampire lore. What if there's no tomb because there was no death? What if Vlad the Impaler didn't just inspire the myth? What if he is the myth? The idea that his grave is empty because he never stayed in it has persisted for centuries, whispered across wine glasses and in tourist shops that sell bat-themed everything. But even if you strip away the fangs and fog, the absence of a grave still matters, because it robs history of closure. It denies us the moral punctuation mark at the end of the sentence. When tyrants die, we like to know where. We need the tomb. The tomb is proof of mortality. And Vlad? He refuses to stay dead in any measurable way. His face is still plastered across Romania's tourist brochures. His name echoes in pop culture. His crimes are dissected by historians, defended by nationalists, and romanticized by Gothic enthusiasts who've never smelled burning flesh. And his body, still unaccounted for. He ruled through horror. He disappeared into mystery, and he left behind only legend. Which brings us to another disappearance too, actually. Princes, young, royal, locked in a tower, then never seen again. Not vampires, not monsters, just boys. And that might be worse. The princes in the tower. They were 13 and 10 years old. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, heirs to the English throne, sons of a dead king, vanished behind the walls of the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. No final word, no royal burial, no public execution, just two boys in a fortress, and then silence. A silence so thick, so loaded, it's still echoing more than 5 centuries later. The facts we do have are few and heavy. In April 1483, King Edward IV died unexpectedly. His eldest son, Edward V, just 12 at the time, was set to inherit the throne. But before he could be crowned, his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector, a temporary steward, a guardian of the realm. You know how this ends. Edward V was placed in the Tower of London, supposedly for protection before his coronation. Then Richard brought in the younger brother, Richard of York. Then he declared both boys illegitimate, claiming their parents' marriage was invalid, and had himself crowned King Richard III. It was a breathtaking power grab, the kind of Machiavellian maneuver that leaves a stain no coronation robe can cover. After that, the boys were seen only a few times glimpsed at a window, spotted in the courtyard. Then nothing. The records go quiet. The tower holds its breath, and history folds in on itself. There was no announcement of death, no formal charges, no execution recorded. Just 2 royal children who stopped being seen. Theories, naturally, blossomed like mold in the damp corridors of the tower. The most widely accepted story is also the darkest, that Richard III had them murdered, that their deaths were a necessity to solidify his usurped throne, that he sent a loyal servant, perhaps Sir James Tyrrell, or one of the Tower's constables, to do the unthinkable in secret, smother the boys in their sleep and bury them under stone. But that's the thing about power. It rarely leaves fingerprints when it kills. Richard III denied the charges. So did his supporters. Some even claimed the boys were still alive, hidden away for their own safety. A few whispered that the princes had fled across the Channel or were being raised in obscurity under false names. Convenient? Sure. Comforting? Maybe. But unlikely. In 1674, workers at the Tower discovered a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. Inside were two small skeletons. Charles II ordered the remains moved to Westminster Abbey and interred in a marble urn labelled simply, "Here lie the remains of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York." Problem solved? Not even close. The bones were never definitively identified. No DNA testing. No conclusive analysis. Just a royal assumption and a desperate need to tidy up a national disgrace. In the centuries since, the mystery has only gotten denser. Some historians have pointed the finger at Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard III and founded the Tudor dynasty. Maybe he had the boys killed after his victory, to eliminate rival claimants and retroactively pin the crime on the previous regime. Or maybe they really did die at Richard's command. Maybe it wasn't personal, it was math. 2 boys equaled too many variables. So he subtracted them from history. But if that's true, why hide it? Richard didn't shy away from violence. He executed rivals. He crushed dissent. Why not own the decision? Why vanish the princes instead of parading their deaths as a grim warning? Because even Richard understood that killing children, even in the brutal calculus of medieval politics, was a different kind of crime, a moral fracture, the kind of act that haunts not just a reign, but a nation. And so the Tower remains, part prison, part palace, part tomb. Tourists now walk the same halls, snapping selfies in rooms where just maybe 2 frightened boys were quietly erased. The mystery of the princes in the Tower has become its own kind of currency, a tale retold in books, plays, films, and endless forensic speculation. Each retelling tries to close the door on that room, to exhume the truth, but the truth refuses. The room stays shut. And in that room, 2 crowns still wait. Empty. But England wasn't alone in its royal vanishing acts. Across the Channel, another prisoner was locked away behind stone walls, his face hidden, his name erased. His story, depending on who you ask, was either a tragic accident of history or a royal scandal so enormous it had to be smothered with a mask. The Man in the Iron Mask. He died in 1703. Quietly. Without family. Without a name. Without a proper past. His grave in the Bastille was marked with a false identity, his few possessions destroyed, his cell sealed. Even the man who recorded his death was working from a script, and that script had one goal: erase everything. Except, of course, the mask. The mask was iron, or maybe black velvet stiffened with metal ribs. Witnesses disagreed. What they did agree on was this: he wore it at all times, sleeping, eating, breathing. A prisoner with no face, a man-shaped riddle locked in a royal oubliette. We call him the Man in the Iron Mask, but no one knows who he was. And that's the real crime, because this wasn't a rogue peasant or garden variety criminal. This was someone the French monarchy considered so dangerous not for what he did, but for who he was that they erased his very identity. They didn't execute him. They didn't exile him. They did something worse. They locked him away and hid his face. The first confirmed record of the masked man appears in 1669, when he was transferred to the fortress of Pignerol under the custody of one Bening d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, a trusted prison governor. From that point on, his movements track Saint Mars's career like a shadow. Wherever St. Mars was assigned a fortress, a monastery turned prison, finally the Bastille, the masked man followed. That's no accident. That's containment. He was treated unusually well for a prisoner. Private cell, clean clothes, musicians sent to play outside his room. Not quite luxury, but not torture either. This was preservation. They weren't trying to break him. They were trying to bottle him, keep him alive, but hidden. So who was he? The theories range from plausible to insane. One of the earliest rumours popularised by Voltaire, who spent time in the Bastille himself, claimed the prisoner was an illegitimate brother of Louis XIV, that the Sun King had a secret twin born minutes apart who posed such a threat to royal succession that he had to be buried alive in a mask. It's pure melodrama, but it's stuck. It's the theory people want to be true. Twins. Intrigue. A monarchy so insecure it hid its own blood. Others say the masked man was the son of Anne of Austria and Cardinal Mazarin, a love child whose mere existence undermined the divine right of kings, or a disgraced noble who knew too much, or a valet who had seen something he shouldn't have, or a political decoy used in a swap that went wrong, or one theory darker than all the others a stand-in, that the man behind the mask was Louis XIV, and the monarch who ruled was the impostor. A theory too ridiculous to believe and too delicious to ignore. Modern historians have proposed real candidates. Eustache Dogger, for example, a valet whose name appears in connection with the masked man. But there's no conclusive link, no evidence he warranted such treatment. His crime, if it was a crime at all, was never recorded. The more you look, the less you find. That's the pattern. Speculation, dead ends, controlled leaks. Even the mask itself is a contradiction. Some accounts describe it as iron. Others insist it was soft cloth or leather, made to look like iron, a visual prison more than a physical one. If so, the cruelty becomes even more perverse. A symbol strapped to the head. A performance of dehumanization. The mask said, "You are not allowed a face." The prison said, "You are not allowed a name." The grave said, "You were never here." France, with its revolution looming a century later, left behind this Gothic relic, a reminder that even in the most refined courts, paranoia wears perfume. The monarchy could gild its halls, orchestrate ballets, and declare itself chosen by God, but in its bowels, it still locked men away like demons. And what's most unsettling is how easily it worked. The system didn't break to hide the masked man, it operated exactly as designed. The paper trail is clean, the death was orderly, the silence perfect. And so the man in the iron mask remains unsolved not because of chaos, but because of control. The state buried him so neatly that even the myth feels manicured. But masks have a way of reflecting back the system that made them. And if France had a prisoner whose face threatened power, Bulgaria had a king whose death was so timely, so political, and so suspicious it might as well have been scripted. No mask, no disguise, just a coffin, a dictator, and an emperor whose heart may have stopped too conveniently. Tsar Boris III's mysterious death. In August 1943, the King of Bulgaria got into a train after visiting Adolf Hitler, and within days, he was dead. Coincidence? They said. Official cause of death, heart failure. Acute heart failure, to be exact. Sudden, terminal, tragic, but natural. That was the story offered to the public, the press, the foreign embassies, and the anxious royalists pacing palace halls in Sofia. But almost no one believed it, because Boris III wasn't just a king. He was the balancing act of a regime keeping Bulgaria's spine upright in the contorted contortionist game that was World War II diplomacy. And his death didn't feel like a twist of fate, it felt like a severed brake line. Let's unpack the mess. Bulgaria, during World War II, was one of those smaller powers that got caught in the suction vortex of the big ones. Hitler wanted it in the Axis. Stalin had eyes on it. Churchill needed it neutralized. Boris? He just wanted Bulgaria to survive the 20th century without being eaten alive. He joined the Axis in name but refused to send troops to the Eastern Front. He courted Nazi favor but blocked the deportation of Bulgarian Jews. He accepted German weapons but resisted German orders. His entire wartime strategy was built on the fine art of saying yes while doing no. And then, in the summer of 1943, Hitler summoned him to Germany. The meeting was tense. Witnesses say Boris returned, visibly shaken, exhausted, grim, silent. 2 weeks later, he collapsed. Doctors were called, royal physicians, German physicians. The kind of medical entourage that usually exists to assure people that everything is fine, except this time, no one could agree on what had happened. One autopsy said heart failure, another said it looked like poison, a third waved its hands and blamed stress. And then came the silencing. The palace locked down, statements became vague, doctors vanished from public view. The king's body was embalmed with alarming speed, and an elaborate state funeral was held that was more about optics than answers. And from there, the theories blossomed. Poison by the Nazis, or maybe by the Soviets, or by someone within his own cabinet, tired of royal hedging. Was it something slipped into his tea during the train ride? Was it a compound designed to mimic a heart attack? A subtle poison engineered for plausible deniability? Even now, the list of suspects reads like a Cold War fever dream. The Nazis had motive. Boris was stalling them, defying orders, and refusing to hand over Bulgarian Jews. His refusal to send troops against the Soviet Union was an embarrassment to the Axis. Hitler had gotten rid of enemies before. He wouldn't hesitate. The Soviets, too, had motive. Boris was a monarch, a symbol of the old order, and his sudden death helped destabilize Bulgaria in just the right way for Soviet interests to exploit post-war. And then there's the deeply Bulgarian possibility that he was killed not by outsiders, but from within. That his dance across the tightrope had made too many enemies on both sides. A death of exhaustion, yes, but not from biology, from politics. But if you wanted to look for truth, you won't find it in the medical reports. Those were edited, redacted, lost, or rewritten to fit the narrative of the new Bulgaria that rose from his ashes. Even his remains were not left in peace. After his death, his heart was supposedly removed and buried separately, perhaps to preserve it, or perhaps to hide evidence. During the communist era, his grave was desecrated. His tomb was blown up, his bones scattered, some recovered, others gone. Even in death, Boris could not stay whole. So we are left with fragments, a suspicious timeline, inconsistent reports, a nervous palace, and a geopolitical chessboard that demanded sacrifices. And for all the theories, all the whispers, the most unsettling possibility is also the most mundane, that his heart simply gave out after returning from Berlin. That the strain of trying to be a good man in an evil moment crushed him from the inside. But what kind of ruler dies of conscience? And what kind of world needs that death to look like an accident? Either way, it was the end of an era, and the start of a legend. Boris became a martyr to ambiguity, a king remembered more for how he died than how he ruled. But not all vanished royals are buried under suspicion. Some are buried under hope. Because while Boris was mourned in Europe, across the sea, an entire nation was waiting for a king who refused to stay dead. A monarch who vanished on the battlefield and never returned because they believed he was never supposed to. They called it Sebastianism, and they are still waiting. King Sebastian's return. In the summer of 1578, a young king rode into Morocco with a sword in his hand, a cross on his banner, and no clear plan for how to win. His name was Sebastian I of Portugal, 24 years old, battle-hungry, messianic, and suicidally confident. He was told not to go. The Pope warned him. His advisors pleaded. Even his own generals hesitated. Sebastian ignored them all. He believed he had been chosen by God, by history, by fate, to lead a holy war and revive the glory of crusades past. His target was the Moroccan throne. His mission, restore Christianity to North Africa and make Portugal the hammer of God. Instead, he vanished. The Battle of Alcácer Quibir, also called the Battle of the Three Kings, was a disaster before it began. The Moroccan forces outnumbered the Portuguese and their allies. The terrain was unfamiliar. The sun punished every movement. The Portuguese army, poorly supplied and poorly led, was surrounded, crushed, and obliterated. Sebastian, last seen in battle armor, galloping headlong into the chaos, was never seen again. No body was found. And that's where things stopped being history and started becoming theology. Because when a king dies, people grieve, but when a king disappears, people wait. Portugal waited. At first, they searched. There were reports of corpses matching his description. Some claimed his body had been found among the fallen. Others swore he had been captured and dragged in chains to Fez. The Moroccan Sultan claimed to possess his body but refused to return it unless the Portuguese paid a ransom. Later, Spain stepped in and claimed a corpse had been retrieved and buried in the Jerónimos monastery in Lisbon. But few believed it. No official confirmation, no witnesses, no wound marks matched. The coffin was sealed. The uncertainty was weaponized. And so, Portugal did what humans always do when fact collapses under the weight of desire. They turned their missing king into a messiah. The phenomenon became known as Sebastianism. According to the myth, Sebastian had not died in Morocco. He had gone into hiding, into exile, into the mists of divine preparation. He would return one day, riding out of the fog, clad in armor, to save Portugal from its enemies and restore it to greatness. He was the encoberto, the hidden one, a sleeping king, an immortal redeemer. He became less a monarch than a prophecy, and the prophecy refused to die. In the decades following the battle, dozens of impostors emerged claiming to be Sebastian returned. One said he had been wounded and rescued by desert mystics. Another claimed he had wandered the earth in disguise, learning God's plan. Each was paraded, doubted, jailed, executed. But it didn't matter. The real Sebastian, people believed, was still out there. And when he came back, it would not be quietly. The belief wasn't a fringe cult, it became a national religion of sorts. Entire uprisings were built around Sebastianist hope. The most famous of these was in the 19th century, when a charismatic figure called the Hidden King led followers into the Brazilian jungle, claiming that Sebastian would descend from the clouds. When the movement was crushed by government troops, the survivors didn't lose faith. They said the king had simply postponed his return again. Even today, in remote corners of Portuguese-speaking communities, the myth flickers. In dreams, in folk songs, in half-remembered prayers. Because Sebastian didn't just disappear, he transformed. His vanishing became a placeholder for national longing. He stood for lost glory, moral clarity, divine purpose. For every moment when Portugal was humiliated, colonized, or forgotten, the hope of Sebastian's return hummed beneath the surface, a story waiting to rewrite itself. But what's most uncanny is how tidy the myth is, how well it fits the shape of human despair. A dead king is final, a lost king is a loophole. Even modern DNA testing and historical re-examinations haven't killed the legend. The grave in Jeronimos Monastery remains sealed, symbolic, ambiguous, and Portugal, officially, has moved on. Unofficially, the myth lives on the border of reality too absurd to believe, too sacred to discard. Because there is something deeply human about refusing to bury a king who didn't come home. And this instinct, this impulse to keep believing, isn't exclusive to Portugal. Across the Atlantic, another empire was built on grandeur, blood, and ritual. But when its rulers vanished, they left nothing behind. Not even a tomb. So now we ask, where are the Aztec emperors? Where are the Aztec emperors? They built pyramids to scrape the sky. They etched entire cosmologies into stone. They bathed cities in gold and blood. And when the sun god demanded nourishment, they offered hearts still beating, still warm. The Aztec Empire was not subtle. And yet, when it fell, its emperors disappeared so completely, so efficiently. It's as if the earth swallowed them out of respect or disgust. Ask anyone where the Aztec emperors are buried, and you'll get a shrug disguised as a theory. For a civilization that chronicled its rituals with almost obsessive detail, whose calendar carved millennia into volcanic rock, whose palaces and temples stood defiantly against both nature and conquest, there is a royal absence where there should be splendor. No mausoleums, no sarcophagi, no royal tombs with golden masks and hieroglyphic eulogies, not even bones. Take Moctezuma II Emperor when the Spaniards arrived, God King of Tenochtitlan, master of thousands. When Cortés marched into the city, Moctezuma greeted him with diplomacy. Gold was given. Feasts were held. Suspicion festered. Within months, the Aztec capital had turned into a cage. Moctezuma became a hostage in his own palace. Then came the rebellion, the riots, the stones thrown by his own people. He died, struck in the head, perhaps by Spaniards, perhaps by Aztecs, depending on which version you believe. But where's the body? No one knows. No documented burial, no royal funeral pyre, not even an unmarked grave. Some say he was cremated and scattered in secret to protect his spirit. Others think the Spaniards dumped his remains in the canals during their retreat, and a few suspect they took his body back with them as a grotesque trophy. But the mystery doesn't stop with Moctezuma. What about the others? Ahuitzotl, the warrior king who expanded the empire to its greatest size. Axayacatl, who defeated the Tarascans and rebuilt the Great Temple. Itzcoatl, the founder of the Triple Alliance? Gone. No royal necropolis. No sacred precinct filled with imperial ancestors. Just urban ruins under modern Mexico City. Layers upon layers of shattered past, and a growing sense that the emperors might have been erased not just by steel and smallpox, but by intentional forgetting. The Spaniards didn't just conquer Tenochtitlan. They leveled it. They buried its sacred spaces beneath cathedrals and colonial architecture. The Templo Mayor, the heart of the Aztec world, was demolished and built over. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeologists began peeling back the city like an onion, finding temples and offerings and sacrificial remains. But no royal burials. That silence is loud. In other cultures, kings were buried with ceremony and spectacle. The Egyptians gave their pharaohs pyramids. The Chinese entombed their emperors beneath artificial hills and rivers of mercury. But the Aztecs, if their rulers were ever buried at all, the locations remain utterly hidden. Either the Spaniards obliterated every trace, or the Aztecs themselves made sure their kings would never be found. It's a possibility worth sitting with. Because the Aztecs believed in cyclical time, in cosmic balance, in gods that died and resurrected, and in rulers who served not as men but as intermediaries between the earthly and the divine. Death was a ritual, not a conclusion. Perhaps the rulers were burned. Perhaps their ashes were returned to the earth, or fed to the fire as an offering. Perhaps the memory of the king was meant to be digested, not preserved. But even so, no fragments, no clues? Modern archaeologists have dug beneath the former palace of Moctezuma. They've combed through the layers beneath the Metropolitan Cathedral. They've identified royal residences, temples, and even ceremonial offerings, but no imperial skeletons, no tombs with jade masks or feathered cloaks or obsidian knives gently resting on a chest once called divine. And the absence matters. Because when you remove the grave, you remove the closure. The story can't end. The ghost isn't laid to rest. And maybe that's the point. The Aztec emperors aren't gone, they're waiting. Not in stone, but in the question mark they left behind. But if we don't know where they ended up, we also don't know exactly how one of them died. Moctezuma's body may be missing, yes, but his death? That, too, remains tangled in contradiction, in political blame, and in one final insult to the empire he ruled. How did Moctezuma II die? It's a question no one can answer without choosing a side. Was he murdered by the Spanish? Lynched by his own people? Struck down in a moment of imperial betrayal or quietly executed in a corner of the palace he once ruled? The answer depends entirely on who's telling the story and what they need you to believe. Here's what we do know. Moctezuma II, 9th Tlatoani of the Mexica, died sometime in late June 1520. The Spanish were barricaded inside his own palace, surrounded by a city turning against them. Tenochtitlan, once docile and diplomatic, had erupted into rebellion. Stones flew, spears rattled, tempers boiled. The empire was on fire. And at the center of it all stood, or perhaps sat in despair, Moctezuma. The Spaniards said he had lost control, that his people no longer saw him as emperor, but as a puppet. That when Hernan Cortés ordered him to speak to the crowds and calm the chaos, he stood on a palace balcony to plead for peace, and that his people answered not with reverence, but with rocks. A stone to the head, another to the chest. The king collapsed. His subjects, they claimed, had killed him themselves. That version became official because it was convenient. It painted the Aztecs as barbarians, ungrateful, self-destructive. It exonerated the Spanish from regicide. It told Europe that they hadn't murdered a king, they had merely watched him fall. But that story smells like a cover-up. First, none of the indigenous chroniclers buy it. The Nahua accounts, many written decades later with the help of surviving Aztec nobles and priests, present a different scene. In these, Moctezuma is murdered inside the palace, quietly, directly, by the Spaniards who had held him prisoner for months. Why? Because he was no longer useful. The crowds outside had turned. Moctezuma's image as divine ruler had disintegrated. He was no longer a shield for Spanish ambition, but a liability, a hostage whose value had expired. So they killed him. Or so the story goes. Some say he was stabbed, others that he was strangled. Still others claim poison subtle, ceremonial, irreversible. One account describes his body being dumped from the palace under cover of night. left on the street for his people to reclaim. Another says they never saw him again. The truth, it drowned in the canals of Tenochtitlan, somewhere between myth and massacre. The sad irony is that Moctezuma's real death happened long before his body collapsed. It happened the moment he welcomed Cortés into the city, the moment he offered gifts, gold, feathers, ceremonial masks, and invited strangers to walk his sacred causeways, the moment he hesitated, the moment he listened too long to omens, the moment he confused diplomacy with destiny. Moctezuma wasn't foolish, he was trapped by prophecy, by politics, by the impossible weight of being the living bridge between gods and men. He had to decide whether to fight or negotiate, and he chose negotiation, and that, in the end, may have killed him more surely than any weapon. His death, like his life, became a symbol. To the Spanish, he was a tragic figure, noble, doomed, necessary. To the Aztecs, he was a traitor or a scapegoat, depending on who you asked. To historians, he's a paradox, a ruler with absolute power who somehow had none when it counted. And now? He is nowhere. No tomb, no bones, no final resting place, just competing narratives and a city built over his capital. Mexico City now rises where his palace stood, where he died either bleeding in his throne room or stoned by the very people who once called him divine. We still don't know which is true, but one thing's certain: his death was the turning point. The world after Moctezuma wasn't the same. Not for Tenochtitlan, not for the empire, not for the continent. And as we look at the vacuum he left behind, we realize he's not the only emperor whose death ended one world and birthed another. Thousands of miles south, in the shadow of the Andes, another emperor met the Spanish. He was promised freedom. He was baptized. He was strangled. But his body, like Moctezuma's, vanished. What happened to Atahualpa's body? In the cold logic of colonial conquest, death is supposed to be the punctuation mark, the moment the story ends. But Atahualpa's death didn't end anything. If anything, it only deepened the mystery. Here was the last true emperor of the Inca Empire seized by a handful of foreign strangers, ransomed for a room full of gold and silver, converted to Christianity under duress, then executed anyway, strangled, quietly, after nightfall, and then, almost immediately, gone. No preserved body, no tomb, no official burial site recognized by history. The man who ruled the largest empire in the Americas at the time of European contact simply vanished into the dirt. The year was 1533. Atahualpa had only recently defeated his half-brother Huáscar in a bitter civil war that left the empire exhausted and blood-soaked. He was consolidating power when the Spaniards arrived. Pizarro and his men, barely a few hundred strong but armed with steel, gunpowder, horses, and the full weight of a worldview that saw foreign emperors as obstacles, not rulers. Atahualpa met them at Cajamarca, expecting diplomacy. He got a massacre. His unarmed retinue was ambushed. He was captured in his litter and held for ransom in a land where wealth could be measured in sun gods and stones. Pizarro demanded gold. Atahualpa agreed. The emperor offered to fill a room once with gold and twice with silver, a literal king's ransom. And he delivered. The treasure came pouring in, ceremonial objects, heirlooms, temple offerings, precious metal artifacts that had never been touched by market logic until now. Each piece, beautiful and symbolic, was immediately melted down into bullion. And once it was done, once the greed was satisfied, the Spaniards killed him anyway. They claimed he was plotting a rebellion, that he was dangerous, that he had to die to prevent further bloodshed. But really, he was a political problem too heavy to carry forward, too important to let go, too sacred to live. And so he was garroted, strangled slowly with a tightening cord on the 29th of August, 1533. He had been baptized the night before, supposedly to save his soul from damnation. His name became Francisco Atahualpa. His execution was now, legally speaking, Christian. Convenient. But what happened next? That's where the ground opens and the story falls through. According to some reports, the Spaniards gave his body to the Inca nobles for burial, a gesture of respect, or appeasement, or paperwork. One account says his mummified remains were taken to Cusco, placed with the other royal dead in the sacred Coricancha temple. That would have been fitting. Inca rulers were not buried to be forgotten. They were mummified, revered, consulted like oracles. Their bodies were dressed, fed, paraded. But no such mummy has ever been found. Other accounts claim something darker, that the Spaniards kept the body for a time as a symbol of victory, that it was buried in secret to avoid creating a martyr, or burned, or dumped into a ravine outside Cajamarca to erase him completely. Yet the stories didn't die. There are whispers that his followers moved his body in the night, hiding it in the mountains. Some say he lies buried beneath a remote chapel in the Andes, beneath layers of moss and missionary renovations. Others say he was secretly returned to Quito, his home city, to rest in the soil he once ruled. But if that were true, why hasn't anything turned up? The Inca were master stonecutters. Their graves were engineered, precise, intentional. Their rituals around death were deeply spiritual. For a ruler like Atahualpa to vanish without architectural trace suggests one of two things. Either his body was destroyed, or it was hidden so completely, so spiritually and physically removed from the known world, that its absence became a statement. Or perhaps it's simpler than that. The Spaniards didn't think his burial mattered. Once dead, he was no longer useful. The room had been filled with gold. The empire was fractured. The gods had been displaced. Why mark the grave of a man they'd already erased? But of course, he wasn't erased. His name endured. His story became a paradox. The emperor who delivered wealth beyond imagining, and then disappeared. And he wasn't alone. Because Atahualpa wasn't the last Inca emperor, only the last living one. The mummies of his ancestors had once sat in court chambers, wrapped in finery, given food and drink, consulted in matters of state. Then the Spanish came, and they vanished too. The vanished Inca royal mummies. You could talk to them. That was the most unsettling part. The Inca mummies, bundled in rich textiles, adorned with jewelry, propped up on thrones, weren't just preserved ancestors. They were political entities, sacred dignitaries, living dead monarchs who received tribute, made appearances, and sat beside their successors at feasts. They didn't just represent authority, they were authority. Which is what made their disappearance all the more devastating. They didn't just bury a tradition, they buried a voice. At its peak, the Inca Empire maintained an intimate relationship with death. Ancestors weren't gone, they were relocated. The dead were not sequestered from the living, they were embedded within daily life, especially the royal ones. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, did not cease to rule after his final breath. His body was preserved, often through natural desiccation, sometimes through intentional mummification, and kept within the palaces, temples, or estates he had built during life. There, his lineage would continue to serve him, maintain his cult, manage his land. His political apparatus remained intact. In fact, new emperors had to build their own wealth and prestige from scratch because their predecessors' estates and mummified presence still owned their previous domains. The result? a government half composed of the dead. Chroniclers from the Spanish conquest describe court meetings where the new emperor would address the mummies of past emperors, seeking their favor or counsel. Priests offered food and chicha beer. Servants carried the royal dead on litters during festivals. Even military decisions were sometimes made in the presence of these silent rulers. And then came the conquest. When the Spanish arrived, they didn't just see a culture with strange funerary practices. They saw political rivals, bodies wrapped in fabric and power. Catholic theology had no room for rulers who ruled from beyond the grave. The presence of mummies wasn't a curiosity, it was an open act of resistance. So they made them disappear. Some were seized, others burned. Some were looted, stripped of gold, silver, ornaments. Others were hidden by the Inca, smuggled into caves and distant villages, disguised or buried in rituals meant to fool colonial eyes. But the most important royal mummies, the ones belonging to the line of emperors, simply vanished. No royal mummy of a Sapa Inca has ever been definitively identified, not one. This is staggering when you consider how central these figures were to Inca governance. Imagine if we had lost every pharaoh's body in Egypt, or every king in the Valley of the Kings. That's what happened here, a complete rupture in continuity, a historical blackout. The disappearance was so thorough, so total, that it begs the question, was it deliberate? Some scholars believe the Spanish authorities, particularly zealous friars, sought not just to suppress the cult of the ancestors, but to annihilate the physical bodies themselves, to erase them from memory, from space, from time. Others think the Inca beat them to it, that the priesthood, sensing the end, hid the mummies in the mountains, that they're still out there, preserved by altitude, wrapped in secrecy, guarded by stories and silence. That in some high valley, a royal bundle still waits, surrounded by offerings, fed by ritual, untouched by centuries of colonial forgetting. We do know this. In 1559, Viceroy Andres Hurtado de Mendoza ordered several royal mummies to be transferred to Lima for inspection. They were paraded, catalogued, studied, then nothing. They were never seen again. Did they rot in some forgotten storeroom? Were they quietly destroyed, hidden by sympathetic clergy? Or do they lie in some misidentified corner of a museum basement, tagged with the wrong name, passed over for being too fragmentary? No one knows. And that's the legacy they left absence in the shape of royalty. Power evacuated, voices muted, faces wrapped in eternal cloth. The Inca believed time moved in cycles, that everything returned, that nothing truly ended. And maybe they're right. Maybe one day a royal bundle will be unwrapped and the face of an emperor will emerge from the dark with gold still on his brow and rebellion in his jawline. Until then, the mummies rule a kingdom of shadows. But shadows don't just hide bodies, they also swallow thrones. And in one legendary case, the throne itself disappeared. Not the ruler, not the empire. The seat of power itself, a dazzling construction of gems, gold, and legend. They called it the Peacock Throne. And it, too, is gone. The Peacock Throne's ultimate fate. Some thrones are metaphors. This one wasn't. The Peacock Throne was real, so real it made kings into gods, enemies into thieves, and empires into museums of plunder. It was a chair, yes, but also an ideology sculpted in gold, draped in diamonds, and carved with imperial certainty. It didn't just represent power, it performed it. And then it vanished. Built under the orders of Shah Jahan in the early 17th century, the same Mughal emperor who commissioned the Taj Mahal, the Peacock Throne, was never meant to be modest. It was, from the start, the purest expression of what happens when divine rule meets limitless resources. Crafted over 7 years by master artisans, it was rumored to have cost twice as much as the Taj itself. The throne's design? Imagine delirium made visible. It stood on legs of solid gold. Its back was a sunburst of radiant gems. Its steps shimmered with rubies and sapphires. At its crown were 2 peacocks facing each other, their jeweled feathers fanned wide, framing a tree of life made of emeralds. Diamonds the size of pigeons glinted from every surface. The whole thing was so blindingly ornate that visitors described it as blasphemy in furniture. But the throne was more than furniture, it was propaganda in solid form, a claim to divinely sanctioned rule not just over India, but over beauty itself. The emperor didn't sit on it, he ascended it. It was meant to be seen. Envoys wept before it. Courtiers bowed to it. It was not an object, it was a ritual. And then came the fall. In 1739, the Persian warlord Nader Shah invaded India. His army sacked Delhi, slaughtered tens of thousands, and looted the Mughal treasury so thoroughly that the empire never fully recovered. Among the countless treasures he took, including the infamous Koh-i-Noor diamond, was the peacock throne. And that's where things start to blur. Nader Shah paraded the throne back to Persia like a celestial trophy. He was photographed by history as the man who broke the Mughals. For a few years, the throne stayed intact. He reportedly sat on it, displayed it, let its light reflect off his ambitions. But after Nader Shah's assassination in 1747, the throne disappears from the record. Some say it was dismantled by his successors, its pieces redistributed among Persia's fractured royalty. Others claim it was destroyed in a palace fire or broken apart during looting. Maybe it was melted down, repurposed into lesser thrones, ceremonial objects, or jewelry. Or maybe more tantalizingly it still exists, in fragments, in hidden vaults, in heirloom pieces whose true origins have been forgotten or deliberately concealed. There are modern replicas in Iranian museums, styled after descriptions of the peacock throne, but none are the real one. None are made from the actual throne that once held the fate of an empire in its golden seat. The original has never resurfaced, and perhaps that's fitting, because the throne was never just gold. It was a stage, a symbol, a fantasy of endless power made temporarily real. When it vanished, it didn't just take wealth, it took the story of Mughal invincibility with it, and that story was irreplaceable. If you believe the more esoteric theories, the throne was cursed, that the rulers who touched it fell soon after, that its beauty was too perfect, too proud, too imperial to exist without consequence. An object too rich to last. A throne too heavy for history to carry. So what remains? Accounts, eyewitness sketches, florid descriptions. Maybe a few gems hidden in other crowns. Anonymous, glittering, complicit. The ghost of a throne scattered across continents and centuries. Its shape lost, but its myth still humming in every jewel too large to be casual. And if the peacock throne vanished into smoke and legend, it wasn't alone. One of the diamonds it once cradled, huge, luminous, cursed, coveted, survived the fall. But it too refuses to tell a straight story, because before it became a colonial symbol, it was already a mystery. And even now, no one knows where the Koh-i-Noor really came from. The Koh-i-Noor's early trail. It's a diamond that has outlived dynasties, a gem so weighed down by blood, legend, and colonial guilt that even locked in a crown, it still feels like it's trying to escape. The Koh-i-Noor Mountain of Light is one of the most famous diamonds in the world, or infamous, depending on which part of history you're reading. And while its modern chapters are etched in imperial controversy and museum lighting, its early history is a mist, a shimmer, a whispered trail of power, passed hand to trembling hand. No one knows exactly where it came from. That's the first mystery. Unlike other royal jewels whose provenance is pinned down by treaties, dowries, or corpse inventories, the Koh-i-Noor emerges into history already wrapped in contradiction. By the time it's recorded, it's already been fought over, which is always a red flag, because objects that cause wars tend not to be born cleanly. Some believe it was mined in Golconda, in what is now Andhra Pradesh in southern India, sometime around the 13th century or maybe earlier. The Golconda mines were known for producing diamonds of exceptional purity, and the Koh-i-Noor, if it came from there, was likely pulled from the earth already cursed with attention. But even that is uncertain. There's no mine ledger, no extraction record, no inscription saying, "You are now holding a world-altering object. Use with caution." Instead, it shows up in legend, sometimes as a third-eye jewel on Hindu deities, sometimes embedded in Mughal regalia, sometimes already covered in blood. By the time Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, mentions it in his memoirs in the early 1502, it had already changed hands at least once, possibly twice, through war and inheritance. He refers to a great diamond acquired during the conquest of Delhi, a gem so valuable it could feed the world for days, but he doesn't name it, and scholars disagree if it's even the same stone. After that, the Koh-i-Noor becomes a kind of shapeshifter, a diamond assumed to be that diamond, a name retroactively applied, a stone that passes between Mughal emperors like a divine tax receipt, too precious to sell, too symbolic to ignore. By the time it reaches Shah Jahan, the emperor who built the peacock throne, it's said to have taken center stage placed in the throne itself, glinting above the sovereign's head, a sun in gemstone form. But again, no confirmation, just accounts, descriptions, eyewitnesses with motives. And then came Nader Shah. When the Persian invader stormed Delhi in 1739 and looted the Mughal treasury, he allegedly spotted the diamond sewn into the folds of the emperor's turban. Legend says he plucked it out with a flourish and whispered, "Koh-i-Noor," giving it the name we now use, though even that might be a later invention. After Nader Shah's assassination, the diamond passed into Afghan hands. From there, it moved again. This time toward Punjab, eventually landing with Ranjit Singh, the Lion of the Punjab, who cherished it not just as a gem, but as a political trophy, a holy relic, a symbol of Sikh power. And then the British came. We know what happened after that: annexation, dismantling of empire, a boy king forced to gift the stone to the crown. The diamond displayed in London as if it had been rescued, not taken. Queen Victoria wore it. Later, it was set into a coronation crown. Today, it sits in the Tower of London, heavily guarded, diplomatically radioactive. But what happened before all that? That's where things go soft. The early path of the Koh-i-Noor is a series of maybes. No one agrees on its original cut. No one can trace its unbroken ownership. Even its supposed curse that any man who wears it will meet ruin may have been a post-colonial invention, written in hindsight after it left a trail of blindings, assassinations, betrayals, and imperial falls. Was it one diamond or a composite? Did it change shape? Was the original recut beyond recognition? Is the stone in London even the real Koh-i-Noor? No one can say for certain. And that's the power of objects like this. Their history is not a timeline, it's a fog bank. They are symbols, myths you can wear, weapons dressed as ornaments. And while the Koh-i-Noor may sit behind glass now, its weight hasn't lessened. Its early trail remains lost, and maybe deliberately so, because knowing too much would force history to choose a side. And nobody wants to be the museum that admits it owns a ghost. But the trail of royal disappearance doesn't stop with diamonds. Some emperors lost more than treasures, they lost pieces of themselves. Like the Ottoman ruler whose heart, they say, was buried far from his body, somewhere in enemy soil, still beating in controversy. Suleiman the Magnificent's heart tomb. By the time he died, Suleiman was already legend. 10 campaigns, 4 wives, 26 children, 30 years of war, 400 poems. The architect of the Ottoman Golden Age and the shadow behind half of Europe's nightmares. In the West, he was called the Magnificent. In the East, the Lawgiver. Either way, he didn't ask for those names. He earned them. And yet, his heart quite literally is missing. Or at least, not where it's supposed to be. The official records state that Suleiman the Magnificent died on the 6th of September, 1566, during the siege of Sigedvar, in what is now southern Hungary. He was 71 ancient by Ottoman imperial standards, and still leading his army into battle. Not from the rear, not from the comfort of a campaign tent, from the front. But his death didn't stop the siege. In fact, it was hidden. His death was kept secret by his Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who feared the morale collapse that would follow if the army knew their emperor was gone. So while Ottoman troops battered the fortress walls and prepared for their final push, Suleiman's body was carefully wrapped, preserved with herbs and wax, and shipped back to Constantinople under cover of darkness. But before that journey began, according to legend, his heart was removed. Why? It depends on who's telling the story. Some say it was a spiritual act, the emperor's heart left behind in the land he died for, as a token of imperial devotion. Others say it was a logistical decision, easier to preserve and transport the body without the organ. Some whisper it was an old Turkic tradition that part of the ruler should be buried at the site of conquest to mark the soul's final victory. Either way, the heart stayed behind, and where exactly it was buried has been a mystery ever since. For centuries, locals in Sigedvar believed that Suleiman's heart, along with some of his internal organs, was entombed near the battlefield. Not in a grand imperial tomb, but beneath a humble turbe, a small Ottoman mausoleum. Nearby, a mosque and military outpost were built, forming a kind of sacred outpost in Christian Europe. A shrine not to religion, but to empire. But after the Ottomans retreated and the Austrians took control, the site was erased. Literally. The buildings were leveled, the grave markers shattered, the ground resown with new architecture and new memory. Over time, the location of the turbe faded from maps and minds alike. The soil buried the past, and Suleiman's heart, if it was ever there, vanished beneath centuries of denial. Only in recent years did archaeologists begin to rediscover what might be the long-lost heart tomb. Foundations of Ottoman buildings were found, soil anomalies, ceramics. Some scholars declared they had finally located this sacred site using maps, satellite imaging, and Ottoman texts. Others disagreed. The evidence was circumstantial, the fragments inconclusive. No coffin, no human remains, and certainly no preserved heart in a box, waiting patiently for verification. Just the idea of Suleiman, an echo, a rumor with historical credentials. But even if they found it, what would they find? A heart 5 centuries old would be gone. Dust, at best, a stain in the soil, at worst, a metaphor. And that might be the point. Because the heart tomb was never about anatomy, it was about presence. Suleiman died on foreign soil and refused to fully leave. He ruled with sword and pen, mosque and cannon, and when he died, he claimed the land not just with blood, but with himself. His actual tomb, back in Istanbul, is grand and imperial adjacent to the Süleymaniye Mosque, his architectural legacy. His sarcophagus rests beneath domes and Quranic verses. Tourists visit. Guides explain. Photographs are taken. But it's the missing part of him, the heart, that still causes tremors. Because the heart is where rulers become symbols. And missing hearts? Those are for saints, martyrs, or kings who knew how to stay in multiple places at once. And he's not the only one. The ancients had their own mystery ruler, one who supposedly died in glorious battle, or maybe didn't. A monarch whose death is so contested, so tangled in legend and propaganda, that even 2,500 years later, no one agrees how or if he died at all. His name was Cyrus, and his ending is still wide open. How did Cyrus the Great die? For a man who built the first real superpower in history, a multicultural empire stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, one that pioneered the idea of religious tolerance, postal systems, and human rights, it's almost comical how little we know about how Cyrus the Great died. Not because there aren't accounts, there are plenty. Too many, in fact. The problem is they all contradict each other, and every single one of them smells like propaganda, guesswork, or poetic license. Let's begin with the most dramatic version. The one written by Herodotus, who never met a plot twist he didn't love. In his telling, Cyrus died fighting the Massagetae, a fierce nomadic people who lived beyond the northeastern frontiers of Persia. According to this version, Cyrus tried his usual mix of diplomacy and sneakiness to conquer them. He offered to marry their queen, Tomiris. She declined. He sent wine to get their warriors drunk, then ambushed them. Her son, intoxicated and captured, took his own life out of shame. Tomiris, in grief and fury, assembled her army and crushed the Persians in battle. Cyrus was killed. And then this is the part Herodotus couldn't resist. She found his body, decapitated him, and shoved his head into a bag of blood, declaring, "Now drink your fill." It's a vivid scene, cinematic, poetic justice, served cold and sticky, but also questionable. Other ancient historians, like Ctesias, a physician at the Persian court, who insisted he knew better, offered a different version. In his story, Cyrus died not in battle, but in a skirmish against Derbyshans, another nomadic tribe, with the help of Indian war elephants, because why not? Cyrus was wounded, carried from the battlefield, and died days later from complications. Ctesias also claimed Cyrus's body was retrieved and buried in peace at Pasargadae, his capital, in a tomb he had prepared for himself. The tomb still exists today, a simple, austere stone monument standing alone in a desert plain. Alexander the Great visited it centuries later and reportedly wept at the humility of its design. But the battle? The wounds? The elephants? No archaeological evidence confirms any of it. Still others suggest Cyrus died peacefully, in bed. An old king with a long life, a good death, boring, convenient. But nothing about Cyrus was boring. He had conquered Babylon not with violence, but with strategy. He'd marched in as a liberator, not an invader. He'd respected the gods of the people he conquered. He allowed exiled peoples like the Jews to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. He built roads, minted coins, and treated kings like governors and gods like negotiable partners. So the idea that this ruler, whose life was a blend of idealism and empire, would end it all in a messy border war with a steppe queen or quietly slip away from infection just doesn't sit right. And perhaps that's the point. Cyrus wasn't supposed to just die. His death was supposed to mean something. And so history rushed in to fill the silence with stories. Violent ends, glorious defeats, moral parables. And the body? Well, that's another mystery. His tomb at Pasargadae was looted long ago. When Alexander arrived, the coffin was reportedly empty. The gold and robes gone. No body, no remains. Just a stone box and fading inscriptions. No one knows when or how the tomb was robbed, or if it ever actually held Cyrus's body at all. Which leads to the most unsettling possibility. That Cyrus disappeared twice. Once from the battlefield, and once from his own grave. There's something fitting in that. A king who built the first empire, built on pluralism, tolerance, and political myth, slipping into legend himself. A man who wrote history with policy rather than monuments, who governed through reputation more than fear. He became too big for one ending. And he's not alone in that category. Because across the Red Sea, in the lands of incense and split allegiances, another royal enigma has outlived empires and excavators alike. A queen, maybe. A monarch, possibly. A legend, definitely. She was the Queen of Sheba, and no one can even agree where she ruled from. Who was the Queen of Sheba, and where was her capital? She appears once and is never forgotten. In a swirl of incense, gold, riddles, and silk, the Queen of Sheba steps into the story of Solomon and then exits just as quickly, leaving behind 1,000 years of theological echo, poetic speculation, and geopolitical arguments disguised as archaeology. Sheba, one of the most elusive ancient kingdoms ever mentioned in scripture, a kingdom so rich it needed no introduction. Its queen unnamed in most accounts. Unnamed but unforgettable travels with a caravan so long it clogs the horizon. Camels sagging under gold, spices perfuming the desert for miles. She arrives in Jerusalem not with war, but with questions. And riddles. Always the riddles. Her mission? To test Solomon's wisdom, to see if the stories were true, to find out if the king who could control demons and speak to animals had anything to say to a mortal queen. He passed. Depending on which version you read, they debated theology or trade routes or the nature of life. They exchanged gifts. They traded riddles and loaded silences. Some say she converted to his faith. Others say she went home pregnant. Some say she seduced him. Others insist he tricked her. The Book of Kings goes quiet after her visit. The Quran retells her tale under the name Bilqis, with jinn, talking birds, and a flying throne thrown in for flair. But the question still hanging in the desert air is this: who was she? And more importantly, where was her kingdom? The traditional answer? Yemen. More specifically, the ancient Sabaean kingdom, centered around Ma'rib, in what is now modern-day Yemen. The Sabaeans were a powerful South Arabian civilization, rich from incense trade, skilled in irrigation and architecture. They built dams, temples, cities lined with columns. The title Queen of Sheba fits like a royal glove. But there's a problem. Archaeology doesn't confirm her existence. No inscriptions mentioning her by name, no royal tomb, no carved relief showing her caravan leaving for Jerusalem. The Sabaean queens that do appear in records come centuries after Solomon's supposed reign. And while some argue the legend may have drawn from earlier oral traditions, the timeline gets shaky fast. So we move across the sea to Ethiopia, because Ethiopian tradition tells a different story. There, she's not the Queen of Sheba, she's Makeda. And her story doesn't end in Jerusalem, it begins there. According to the Ethiopian national epic, Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings, Makeda visited Solomon, was given wisdom and a son Menelik I, who later returned to Jerusalem as a young man. Solomon welcomed him and tried to keep him. But Menelik left, taking with him not just Solomon's bloodline but the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, that Ark. The story claims it was brought to Axum, where it remains today in a secret chapel guarded by a single monk. But that's another mystery. What matters here is this. Ethiopian monarchs, for centuries, claimed descent from Solomon and Makeda. It wasn't just a myth. It was a foundation, a political theology that legitimized rule. That made Ethiopia not just another African kingdom, but the final heir of biblical royalty. So who's right? Was Sheba in South Arabia or East Africa? Was Makeda Sabaean, Aksumite, a hybrid of both? Some scholars suggest Sheba was a cultural zone that spanned both sides of the Red Sea, with overlapping trade, language, and belief. That the queen was real, but her story passed through so many filters, so many mouths and motives, that the details now flicker like desert mirages. We search for her in ruins, in temple inscriptions, in DNA lines, in legend. We find fragments, pillars in Marib, coins in Axum, references in ancient geographies, but no final answer. No capital city confirmed, no throne room excavated, no tomb with a queen's name etched in gold. Only stories. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Sheba is a threshold, not a location. A queen who stepped into myth because history could not hold her. A figure so magnetic that multiple cultures claimed her, remade her, married her to their gods and kings. She's not just missing, she's everywhere. And, while she haunts 2 continents, another ruler half a world away left only his bones, or rather, the absence of them. Because when Kamehameha the Great died, his people didn't build a pyramid. They hid him. Kamehameha's secret burial. He conquered the Hawaiian Islands with fire and diplomacy, unified a scattered archipelago through sheer force of will, stood firm as Western powers arrived with guns, God, and germs. And when he died, his people made sure no one would ever find him again. Kamehameha. I didn't just disappear. He was hidden. By design, by ceremony, by a cultural code deeper than any royal edict. According to Hawaiian custom, the bones of an ali Inu, a high chief, especially one as powerful as Kamehameha, carried tremendous mana. Not just spiritual energy, but divine authority. His bones were a weapon, a relic, a crown, and a curse, all in one. If someone got their hands on them, they could control or destroy entire bloodlines. So, when Kamehameha died in 1819, a secret operation was set in motion. His body was taken, wrapped, and watched over by a small group of trusted men. Then, 2 caretakers chosen from among his most loyal carried him to an unknown location, a cave, a cliffside, a lava tube. No one knows. They buried him in silence, and then they vanished. There are no maps, no markers, no chants passed down through generations that would betray the location. These men likely took the knowledge to their graves. Because that was the point. Kamehameha's mana had to be protected, not displayed. His tomb is not a monument, it's a secret. There have been theories, of course, whispered guesses. Some say the burial site lies on the cliffs of Kohala, where Kamehameha was born. Others suggest it's in a sea cave only accessible during low tide, or a lava tube sealed shut by deliberate collapse. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the pressure to find Kamehameha's remains grew louder, mostly from Western anthropologists and colonial administrators who couldn't comprehend a royal legacy that existed without a shrine. They wanted a tomb, something they could fence off and photograph. But native Hawaiians refused. Even when Kamehameha's direct descendants were tracked and high-ranking Hawaiians were pressured to reveal what they knew, the silence held. That silence is the burial. Some scholars have argued that even if the site were found, revealing it would be a profound act of cultural violence. Not just a violation of Kamehameha's dignity, but a betrayal of the very concept of mana itself. A desecration masquerading as archaeology. Because this isn't just about bones. It's about a worldview. Kamehameha's burial represents something most modern cultures can't process. The idea that not knowing is sometimes sacred. That forgetting, when done intentionally, can be an act of preservation. In Hawaiian belief, the body is not just a shell. It holds the residual force of a life lived in alignment or conflict with the gods. And Kamehameha's life was anything but mild. He had seen omens, made war, united kingdoms, met with foreign powers and weighed their gifts against his people's future. When he died, his bones weren't just remains, they were narrative artifacts. So, they hid them. Because power that great cannot be left lying around. Even today, the state of Hawaii recognizes the 11th of August as a day to honor his memory, but the location of his remains remains deliberately unknown. Tourists visit statues, children chant his genealogy, but the man himself is still buried somewhere out there in lava and secrecy. It's the kind of mystery that resists solving. Because the truth wouldn't satisfy. The truth would diminish the myth. The truth would become a pin on Google Maps, and someone would charge admission. Instead, Kamehameha is both present and absent. A king made eternal not by preservation, but by erasure. And in that erasure, he joins a larger lineage of royals whose final moments were obscured, contested, or rewritten. Including one royal family whose bloody end was officially solved, except it wasn't. Because in Nepal, in 2001, a gun went off, a palace went silent, a country stopped breathing, and nobody agrees on what really happened. The 2001 Nepal Palace Massacre. The last royal dinner in Nepal began with candlelight and ended in carnage. On the night of the 1st of June, 2001, 10 members of the Nepalese royal family were shot to death inside a private room of the Narayanhiti Palace in Kathmandu. It was a massacre with no precedent, no survivors to speak freely, no clear motive. And, to this day, no universally accepted explanation. The official story? Crown Prince Dipendra did it. That's what the government said. That's what the press repeated. That's what the history books hesitantly wrote down in ink that still hasn't dried. They claimed the 9-year-old heir to the throne entered the family gathering heavily intoxicated, angry over a dispute with his parents, specifically over his choice of bride. He wanted to marry a woman of his own choosing, Devyani Rana. His mother, Queen Aishwarya, objected. His father, King Birendra, didn't intervene. That night, the prince reportedly drank heavily, smoked cannabis, and took a dive into his personal armory. Then, just after 9 p.m., dressed in military fatigues, Dipendra walked into the royal gathering with at least 3 weapons, an M16 rifle, a Glock, and a machine pistol. He opened fire, methodically, mercilessly. 10 members of the family fell, including King Birendra and Queen Aishwarya. Dipendra then allegedly turned the gun on himself. He was found in a coma, and in one of the most surreal constitutional footnotes in modern monarchy, he was declared king while unconscious. For 3 days, Nepal had a comatose monarch. Then he died. and the crown passed to his uncle, Gyanendra, the only senior royal who had not attended the dinner. If that version sounds a little convenient, you're not alone. From the start, the story had holes large enough to drive a military jeep through. First, why would Dipendra, educated in Eton, trained in Sandhurst, and reportedly admired by many, commit such a sudden act of annihilation over an argument that had supposedly been simmering for years? Second, how did he single-handedly manage to kill or fatally wound 10 members of a royal family, many of whom were also trained in firearms and security, without anyone stopping him? Third, why was the scene so quickly cleaned? The palace was reportedly washed down before a thorough forensic investigation could take place. Bullet holes were patched. Evidence vanished. Fourth, the 2 guards who reportedly saw the prince enter and exit the gathering both died under suspicious circumstances within months. And then there's the most uncomfortable question of all. Why was Gyanendra, the only major royal not present, installed as king so seamlessly? Why did he seem ready? Conspiracy theories bloomed like mold in a locked room. Some said Gyanendra orchestrated the massacre to seize the throne, that he manipulated Dipendra or framed him posthumously. Others claimed foreign agents, perhaps from India or China, engineered the chaos to destabilize Nepal's delicate monarchy. Some speculated that the prince had uncovered a larger political or financial scandal, perhaps involving palace corruption, arms deals, or foreign bribes, and was silenced before he could act. And some say the entire love affair motive was a smokescreen. Too personal, too tabloidy, too neat. The government conducted a 2-week investigation. Just 2 weeks. It produced a vague, unconvincing report, concluding that Dipendra had acted alone. Case closed. But the Nepalese public wasn't convinced. Neither were many international observers. Mass protests broke out. Candlelight vigils turned into anti-monarchy demonstrations. Trust in the palace collapsed. And from that night forward, the monarchy was living on borrowed time. By 2008, it was gone. Nepal became a republic. The centuries-old Shah dynasty was dismantled with barely a whimper. The massacre hadn't just killed a family, it had killed a system. And yet, there was no justice, no trial, no exhumation, no answers. Just whispers. The kind that linger in palace corridors, the kind that echo under locked gates, the kind that follow the last remaining survivors of an ancient bloodline as they try to live ordinary lives under extraordinary shadows. And while Nepal's royal mystery remains tangled in silence, another imperial legacy hides beneath layers of stone and smoke far to the east beneath Vietnamese soil. Because the body of Emperor Quang Trung is still missing. And the question is, was it ever buried at all? Emperor Quang Trung's lost tomb. In life, he moved like fire. Nguyen Hue, better known by his regnal title, Emperor Quang Trung, was a man who reshaped Vietnam with the kind of velocity that makes historians dizzy. A peasant-born genius turned warlord turned emperor, he didn't just win battles, he unraveled centuries of Chinese domination, crushed rival dynasties, and tried to rebuild an entire nation with brute intelligence and sheer force of will. And then, abruptly, he died. In 1792, just a few years after his most stunning victories, Quang Trung collapsed in his palace in Phu Xuan, now Hue, still in his prime. No violent end, no battlefield blaze. Just sudden illness, or exhaustion, or something darker. The records are frustratingly vague, and that's just the beginning of the mystery. Because after his death, after the mourning, the rituals, the panic, his body vanished. No tomb has ever been conclusively identified as his. No monument in his name. No imperial mausoleum, not even a marker hidden in a forgotten grove. The man who broke the Tring lords, who humiliated the Qing army at the Battle of Ngok, Hui Dongda, who nearly changed the future of Southeast Asia, simply evaporated into the soil of history. This is not how emperors are supposed to go. Vietnamese tradition, particularly among ruling dynasties, placed immense importance on imperial burial. Tombs weren't just resting places, they were sacred geographies, carefully chosen for feng shui, guarded by dragon statues and stone mandarins, layered with symbolic architecture. To be buried properly was to be immortalized. It meant legitimacy, permanence, order. But Quang Trung left none of it. Why? To answer that, we have to return to the politics of his death. Because Quang Trung didn't rule in a vacuum, he ruled in a storm. He was the second emperor of the short-lived Taisan dynasty, which came to power through rebellion and upheaval, and which made powerful enemies fast. The Nguyen lords, ousted by the Taisun brothers, were waiting in the shadows, sharpening their revenge. When Quang Trung died, the Taisun grip on power began to fray almost immediately. His teenage son, Nguyen Quang Tuan, took the throne, but he was no strategist. He lacked his father's vision, charisma, and momentum. The Nguyen loyalists, led by the exiled Nguyen An, later Emperor Jia Long, began pressing their advantage. Within a decade, the Taisun dynasty was obliterated. And here's where things get darker. Once Nguyen An took power and re-established the Nguyen dynasty, he launched a scorched earth campaign against Quang Trung's legacy. Statues were torn down, writings were burned, names were erased, and Quang Trung's body, if it had ever been interred in a tomb, was likely targeted too. One theory says that Quang Trung was buried secretly, in haste, by a small group of loyalists who feared his grave would be desecrated. That his coffin was hidden in the hills outside Hue, or buried beneath a decoy tomb, or lowered into the Perfume River during the night. Other theories suggest he was never given a proper burial at all, that his enemies disposed of his remains, or sealed them away in a forgotten vault never meant to be found. There are whispers half-confirmed archaeological leads of tombs attributed to Taisun figures, fragments of imperial items, stonework that doesn't match Nguyen styling, but nothing definitive. Nothing royal enough, nothing that says, here lies Quang Trung. And this absence is heavy. Because Quang Trung wasn't just a military genius, he was trying to create a new Vietnam, one based on education, merit, reform. He wanted to replace the Confucian Mandarinate with a more egalitarian structure. He envisioned universal literacy. He even plotted to move the capital to a more strategic location. He was dangerous because he was new, and new things often get buried in silence. Today, Quang Trung is remembered with street names and statues. He's honored in textbooks, in speeches, in memorial shrines, but not with a tomb. And so his legacy is missing its foundation, its literal body. A man who tried to reshape his country lies somewhere beneath it, nameless. And that's the final cruelty. His enemies erased his grave, but they couldn't erase the myth. Quang Trung's ghost still haunts Vietnam, not as a king, but as an unanswered question. A monarch without a mausoleum, a revolution without a resting place. And as his mystery brings us to the edge of our journey, we begin to see the pattern. Across continents, cultures, centuries, royal power has a strange afterlife, one that refuses clarity, resists finality, and often, quite literally, disappears. Some were burned, some were buried, some were hidden in gold, others lost in war. But all of them left something behind. Not closure, not certainty, just chill.